The subcommittee will come to order, and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Good morning. Today, a year's worth of negotiations, hearings, and incredible work by members and our staffs have come to a head. Today, we have the unique opportunity to get good things done for the American people. Today, we will mark up and pass the Jumpstarting Opportunity with Broadband Spectrum Act of 2011, easily known as the Jobs Act. Primarily, this legislation is about getting America's economy going again. It is a bill that frees up vast swaths of valuable spectrum, both licensed and unlicensed, and when put into service will unleash new technologies. It will spur innovation in America, and both sides agree it will create as many as 100,000 new American jobs. Think what the advent of wireless broadband has meant to our country, our culture, and our economy. The Jobs Act takes all of that innovation to a new level and creates real private sector jobs. And in the process, the companies who want the spectrum will pay the taxpayers for it, generating upwards of $15 billion toward paying down the deficit and finally meeting the needs of our valued public safety officials by building them their own nationally interoperable public safety broadband network. The Jobs Act does all these things and more. For the nation's free over-the-air broadcasters who just went through an expensive and difficult federally mandated conversion to digital, the Jobs Act provides their viewers the best protections of any competing legislation to make sure Americans can continue to watch their favorite shows and get their news even if their stations have to shift frequencies. The Jobs Act didn't just drop out of the sky. It is a thoughtful and carefully crafted piece of legislation that finds the right balances. Its provisions were improved as a result of the input and counsel from 5 hearings, 11 months of discussions with members of both sides of this committee, the FCC, the NTIA, the industries that rely on spectrum to bring us television and broadband, broadcasters, amateur radio operators, and public safety officials who help us when we need it most. Throughout this process, my staff and I have worked in good faith to find a bipartisan solution. Ms. Eshoo and I met on 9 separate occasions, the last of which included Mr. Waxman in October. A week after that meeting, however, Mr. Waxman wrote to the Supercommittee and asked them to take up the spectrum issue as part of its efforts. We have a copy of his letter for the record. It was at that point that our discussions were indeed suspended, while the Supercommittee was given the opportunity to see if they could work out this issue between the House and the Senate. However, I have long been committed, privately and publicly, to getting legislation done by the end of this year. Our economy needs the help. Americans need the new jobs. We need to generate revenue to reduce our debt, and we need to fulfill our commitment to public safety, which this bill does. The Jobs Act does all of these things and does them well. So today, despite calls for delay, we are moving forward. I yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, and I want to thank you for bringing the Jobs Act forward and to commend you and your staff for the diligent work that you've done in a bipartisan measure to develop a balanced language that will address the spectrum crisis. One idea I'd like to see adopted is to prevent the FCC from using the licensing process to impose regulations that aren't explicitly based on their statutory authority on wireless providers. And I hope we can get to that amendment today. But the bottom line is this: America desperately needs more commercial spectrum for jobs creation, and you've accomplished that here. Cisco reports that by 2015, there will be 15 billion network connections, more than 2 for every person on the planet. This jobs measure will reduce the debt without raising taxes. It will enhance American innovation and jobs creation. That's why we should continue to move the Jobs Act forward, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time, and I yield back the balance of mine, and I now yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, colleagues. Today, our subcommittee considers legislation that has real meaning for our country and our economy, for innovation and competitiveness, and it even helps to pay down our national debt. The mobile revolution represents billions of dollars in ongoing investment and millions of American jobs. Our action on spectrum policy will define our country's ability to lead the world in wireless broadband applications and services. Given the importance of getting spectrum policy right, the chairman, myself, and the dedicated majority and minority staff have worked hard and worked well with each other to shape a bipartisan bill, but we didn't complete our work. There was a delay. We asked for a delay in the markup because of the late notification of the majority's draft. But here we are today, and we're ready to roll our sleeves up and produce the best product possible. I'm hopeful we can resolve some of the policy differences and reach a bipartisan agreement, which has been the long-held tradition of this subcommittee. The Democratic Spectrum Bill, I believe, will contribute to the substance of our work today. That said, I applaud many of the provisions in the chairman's draft. I'm very pleased, and I hope it still is, it will remain on public safety. We know, and I want to welcome the representatives of public safety that have come from different parts of the country to be here with us today, that the 9/11 Commission, in one of its top recommendations a decade ago, said that we had to establish a nationwide interoperable telecommunications network for the safety of the American people. And I'm very proud that we have that in our bill. I'm also pleased that the legislation moves incentive auction authority forward to provide a voluntary process for broadcast spectrum to be converted to mobile broadband. Wireless broadband is transforming our lives and our economy. A study released by Ericsson projects that global mobile broadband subscriptions will approach 5 billion, with a B, 5 billion by 2015, and a Deloitte study reports investment in 4G mobile broadband networks in the United States will add up to $151 billion in GDP growth over the next 4 years, creating approximately 771,000 new jobs. Nowhere in the country are these innovations and what is being brought forward more prominent than in the 14th Congressional District in the heart of Silicon Valley, which I have the privilege of representing. What I'm deeply disappointed in, and I hope that we can have a good discussion on this and work together to make some of the changes, is what I consider the unfortunate policy objective in the chairman's bill regarding unlicensed spectrum. Under this proposal, unlicensed use would be off limits in all spectrum bands subject to incentive auction. Closing spectrum bands to future innovation is foolhardy. And I'm going to say that again. Closing spectrum bands to future innovation is foolhardy. Just last month, the FCC chairman told international stakeholders, quote, unlicensed spectrum fosters the kind of experimentation that leads to vitally important mobile innovations such as Wi-Fi, cordless phones, and Bluetooth. The Senate, in a bipartisan agreement, included language to ensure that the FCC can make an informed decision on unlicensed in the TV band, recognizing that we never close the door to future innovation. Today, unlicensed devices generate between $16 to $37 billion per year for the U.S. economy. With regard to public safety, again, I hope that the majority's view and our view is one and the same. It should be for the American people, and I think that that's one of the major tenets of this legislation. But just as funding and spectrum are essential elements of a nationwide public safety network, so is a strong national governance body. Without such a structure, I think we risk repeating many of the mistakes of the past. Prominent organizations, including the National Governors Association, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors have expressed a desire for a national governance body with certain core oversight responsibilities. We should be working with these organizations to adopt language that retains a national architecture while providing significant opportunity for state and local input. That's a balanced and wise and prudent approach. And as we're equipping our first responders in the field, I urge all of my colleagues on this subcommittee to support this Shimkus-Eshoo bipartisan amendment that will ensure 911 call centers have the tools needed to improve the quality and speed of emergency response. I think I'm over my time, so I'll just close on this note, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time and the effort that you've put into this, that our respective staffs have. I have said from the beginning, I want bipartisan legislation. It is in the tradition of this subcommittee. I believe today we can produce spectrum policy that is going to serve all of the people of our country well. That's what we're here for. That's what our constituents sent us here for. I'm committed to working with you and members of the subcommittee to attain this goal, and I yield back the time that I don't have to yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you stated, this subcommittee has held 5 hearings to examine how the right spectrum policy can provide much-needed additional broadband for consumers, meet the needs of public safety so important, create the jobs that we want, reduce the deficit, and foster innovation across all spectrum-based services. The legislation that we take up today represents what we believe to be a very solid base for achieving all of those goals. Most importantly, the bill will also provide the communications and technology sectors with the very tools that they need to create the jobs and the economic growth. Some estimates of the impact of spectrum legislation have predicted as many as 100,000 jobs to be created by the policies that we consider today. America's unemployed and the overall economy cannot wait any longer. Jobs are essential, but they're not the only benefit of this bill. Through incentive auctions, the Jobs Act will meet the growing demand for commercial, wireless broadband services and all of the innovation that comes with expanded spectrum availability. The bill will also generate in the neighborhood of $15 billion, that's right, with a B for big, in auction revenue for the American taxpayer. The Jobs Act also responds to the needs of public safety. It reallocates the D block to give public safety the 20 megahertz of contiguous spectrum that they have consistently requested, along with a governance model and funding to help make an interoperable public safety broadband network a reality. And finally, the bill takes the lessons learned in previous auctions of government spectrum and fine-tunes the process. This is going to help meet the needs of the government agencies that are reallocating. It will also make the re-proposed spectrum available for commercial services more quickly. So as a result, we're moving forward today with a draft that does not necessarily have bipartisan support at the onset, but that we had hoped for, but one that nonetheless incorporates many of the suggestions made by the Democrats throughout the negotiation process, and I would urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, former chairman of the committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to comment both on the process that brings us here today and the substance of the bill before us. The bad news is that the process has broken down and the substance is in need of serious repair. The good news is that both are fixable. We feel Democrats have not been well treated in this process. During the spring and summer, there were many staff discussions, and our ranking member, Ms. Eshoo, met often with Mr. Walden. When these discussions intensified in September, I also became personally involved. We made a lot of progress. When Ms. Eshoo and I met with Mr. Walden on October 4, We had narrowed our differences to 4 member-level issues. We gave Mr. Walden written proposals on 2 of those issues, and he promised to give us language on a 3rd, the governance issue. But then the Republicans abruptly stopped talking with us. They did not respond to our offers or give us their language. We were told they were going to negotiate with Senator Kerry on the Supercommittee, not us. I didn't like that answer, but I understood it. I wrote, as required by the law, to the Supercommittee that as they look at all the issues that are in our committee's jurisdiction for dealing with the deficit, this area was one area they should look at, but I had hoped before they even reviewed the money part of it that they would have a bipartisan compromise presented to them. Despite our request to put off this markup and resume talks, we've been told that we don't have the time to do this. But to go forward without further discussions, I think is short-sighted. We can move this legislation a lot faster if we work together than if we fight with each other. Turning to the substance, there are only a few issues that are unresolved, but they are significant, and we hope we can have a meeting at least halfway to close them out. On the plus side, you've made, Mr. Chairman, a big step by allocating the D block to public safety. One of the stumbling blocks to an agreement has now been removed. But on 4 other key issues, we're still far apart. These are governance, unlicensed spectrum, auction eligibility, and funding levels. Democratic staff prepared an excellent memorandum that summarizes these issues, and I ask that it be made part of today's record.
Without objection.
First, unlicensed spectrum. Super Wi-Fi is emerging as the defining digital spectrum resource for this decade and beyond. We're not asking that the FCC allocate broadcast spectrum for super Wi-Fi, but we believe it is important that the agency retain the flexibility to do so if necessary. Section, auction bidding. We don't want to preclude the super carriers, Verizon and AT&T, from bidding, but we do want to make sure that the FCC can ensure that competition survives. Third, and perhaps most important, governance. Our members stand squarely with the public safety community and support reallocation of the D block, but it would be foolhardy to set up a network with a faulty governance model. The Republican approach is cumbersome, bureaucratic, and will lead to a patchwork of 50 separate state networks. It will doom us to repeat the mistakes of the past. We would rather work these issues out than fight them out, Mr. Chairman. That's why we're going to hold off offering many of the amendments today. We hope you'll return to the negotiating table after today's markup and as we move to the full committee. This legislation is one of the last pieces of unfinished business from that terrible day 10 years ago when planes crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. We should honor the memory of those who sacrificed so much by coming together to craft a bill we can all support. There are issues that we have genuine philosophical differences to fight out. This is an issue where we have strong support on both sides of the aisle to accomplish the goals. It seems to me that we ought to work out these differences, reach the compromises, present a bill that we know will be law and will address all the concerns that members have. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair now recognizes the former chairman of the committee, Mr. Barton, 4 or 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is great to have you as chairman of the subcommittee. Mr. Waxman, in his opening statement, Mr. Chairman, talked about good news and bad news, and I tend to agree with him on a lot of what he said. The good news is that we're having a markup today, and that's always good for the process to have markups at subcommittee. The bad news is that we're marking a bill up that we really haven't seen until yesterday or the day before, and I do think the minority has got a legitimate issue and that something this important should have some more time. Having said that, I understand your concern and the full committee chairman's concern that because we're late in the year and there is work to be done, sometimes you have to kind of press the process, so to speak. So I understand that. The issue before us in this bill is not a new issue. Back in 2005, when I was the full committee chairman, we addressed it as a part of the Digital Television Act. We allocated 24 megahertz of spectrum to the public sector, public safety sector, and set aside 10 megahertz to be auctioned. I thought that was a fair compromise then, and I still think it's a fair compromise today. It still is the law of the land. Now, there are many advocates in the public safety community that don't support that. And I want to give you and Chairman Upton kudos for trying to solve that political problem, or maybe whatever kind of a problem it is, in that you do allocate the 10 megahertz to the public safety community, but over time they have to give back, as I understand the draft, 14. And, you know, that is a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at it, and it's something that needs to be considered. And in my outreach to the stakeholders in the last day or so, I've had people on both sides be supportive of that, and I've had people on both sides be somewhat reluctant. So, but it's certainly something that's worth looking at. The basic problem that this draft addresses and that the subcommittee and the full committee address is which way to go. Those of us on the Republican side tend to prefer markets. We trust markets as long as they're open and transparent. Most of my friends on the minority side don't trust the market as much, and they want more of a regulation or more of an allocation approach. Your draft tries to address both sides of that issue, and I think it does it in a way that's worthy of consideration. So at the end of the day, I will be voting for this bill, even though I do still think that just an unfettered allocation of that 10 megahertz would be the best public policy and the simplest public policy to allocate. But I understand what you're trying to do and the issue in the Senate, and I'm willing to move forward with the process. With that, Mr. Chairman,
would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I assume when you say unfettered allocation, you meant auction.
Yes, sir.
Of the D block is
Yeah.
your preference.
I thank you for correcting my statement.
I just didn't want you out there where you didn't belong.
I'm glad to have a chairman who protects me.
I try.
Okay. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the Chairman Emeritus, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this will surprise you. First of all, thank you for the recognition. Second of all, I appreciate your kindness. Third of all, my daddy taught me that I should not speak when I could not improve on silence. I will be offering an amendment a little later with my friend Mr. Bilbray, and we will hope that the committee will adopt it. I thank you for this courtesy, and I will expedite the business of the committee by yielding back the balance of my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman very much for his courtesy and his kind comments. Now recognize the distinguished Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Omaha, Nebraska, Mr. Lee Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me and holding this markup. I believe that this bill can be a jump start to our economy and creating new jobs and reducing the federal benefit. I believe that this is one of those win-win-win situations. This bill will allocate spectrum that's absolutely necessary in the private sector as we evolve to a super Wi-Fi mobile society. Frankly, we're right in the middle of that. And the only thing that is preventing us from going further, as much of the world has with mobile devices, is lack of spectrum. This benefits consumers. I have been blessed with 3 sons, 2 of which are teenagers. I can't even imagine how much broadband they use every day from morning till late at night. So it's a win for consumers. It's a win for the taxpayers in that this asset can actually bring dollars in to reduce the deficit. So in essence, taxpayers, consumers win twice. I only have 2 minutes, don't I? One. Never mind. So I think it's imperative that we pass this bill, and the third is public sector wins with this because they get the D block that many of us were not on page of giving them in the early parts, and that's a big movement on our part. I'm sorry that it's not being recognized here today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 1 minute, just as a reminder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding me time. After months of hearings and debate on spectrum, I unfortunately do not believe we are at the point where we should be, which is considering a proposal based on sound policy. The majority bill before us today does not provide public safety with a path towards an effective and efficient nationwide interoperability network, and it does not adequately protect taxpayer monies with a strong governance structure. Instead, the majority bill currently gives awesome power to a single private company to manage the network without any oversight and without meaningful consultation with states and the public safety community. Further, I am concerned that the bill severely limits the FCC's ability to preserve or allocate unlicensed spectrum, which will ultimately hurt America's innovators and, in turn, job creation in this country. I do thank Chairman Walden for including 5 gigahertz language, but I'm looking forward to continue working in a bipartisan manner to improve it, to ensure the Wi-Fi economy meets future demand and innovation. It is my hope the majority will work with the Democratic side to reach a bipartisan agreement. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back balance for time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the bill today. It contains important repacking protections for local broadcast stations and their viewers. These are critical to ensure that free over-the-air TV is preserved and that mobile DTV deployment will continue. Second, I'd like to recognize that the treatment of the 1755 to 1780 megahertz band of frequency is proper, relocating the dozen federal agencies currently in this band, then auctioning it off to wireless providers will generate billions of dollars for the Treasury, and I hope NTIA will act quickly. Today we take the important first step towards bringing more spectrum to the market. More spectrum will promote jobs, reduce our deficit, and it's estimated that wireless broadcast investment will create as many as 205,000 jobs by 2015, and every $1 invested in wireless broadband will create an additional 7 to 10 billion for GDP. I hope these important facts, as well as our flexibility in compromising on the D block, will ensure passage of this bill.
Gentleman.
And I yield back.
Yields back balance of his time. The chair recognizes Mr. Barrow for 5 minutes, or for 1 minute. I'm sorry, not 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we take on the important task of marking up spectrum legislation. As we move forward, I think it's essential that we address our national spectrum needs by adopting a spectrum policy that creates financial incentives for licensees who voluntarily relinquish spectrum while making sure that we have sufficient protections for broadcasters and our public safety community. I'm disappointed we weren't able to come to a compromise and mark up a consensus spectrum bill today. I intend to support the Eshoo-Waxman substitute because I believe it does the right thing from a public safety standpoint, but I believe the Walden bill is a step in the right direction when it comes to generating as much as we can in spectrum auctions. I believe there are a lot of good parts to both these bills, and that there's still time for us to resolve some of our differences before the next markup. I thank the ranking member for the time, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his comments and time. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank you and your staff and my friend Ann Eshoo on working on the next generation 911 amendment. It's going to be tweaked a little bit, but the basic thing is if we move to this new digital age, the PSAPs have to be up to date, and this will help provide money there. So if you want to get some stuff done, work with Anna sometimes, and you can get it done. And so, Chairman, thank you on that. And just a side note on the, unlicensed issue. Approximately, there's 675 megahertz of spectrum below 6 gigahertz is dedicated to licensed use right now. That doesn't even include the white spaces, some of which will remain even after the broadcasting repacking. That's over 100 megahertz more than is available for licensed use below 6 gigahertz. So remember that a spectrum bill is more than just D-block. There's a lot of moving pieces, and I just want to get that in the record, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and the gentleman yields back. Recognize Mr. Towns for 1 minute if he has an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Walden, and, of course, Ranking Member Eshoo. I want to applaud my colleagues for coming this far, and I pledge to work in a bipartisan manner to try to get a bill that both sides can support as we move on. We must move forward because consumer demands for more mobile broadband is undeniable. In addition, and most importantly, we need to provide our public safety community with a modern national interoperable broadband network and a significant amount of auction proceeds dedicated to helping them get organized and started without reversing gains they have already made. I see many of folks from New York in the room, and I appreciate your coming to show how important this is to our city and nation. It is also critically important that we have the opportunity to encourage innovative uses of unlicensed spectrum on a national scale. And finally, many of my disadvantaged and elderly constituents want to be certain that the free over-the-air television is still available. On that note, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bono Mack, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first start by thanking you for your hard work and your dedication on this important legislation. This legislation is a culmination of much effort on the part of many people. I believe the Jobs Act strikes an appropriate balance between enhancing public safety and providing the wireless sector with the spectrum it needs to accommodate the incredible demand brought about by the information age. Indeed, the rapid growth of mobile broadband has been one of the few bright spots in an otherwise difficult economy. Today, as we consider ways to make a good bill better, it's important to remember that spectrum is a finite public resource. No doubt we need a more effective interoperable public safety network, and this legislation moves us in the right direction. It is also important that we take steps today to ensure we can meet the spectrum needs of tomorrow. As I sit here right now, iPod in pocket, or iPod in person, iPad in hand, I can't help but wonder what the technology of tomorrow will bring. It's exciting, and we should do more to promote investment in such an innovative sector. But finally, Mr. Chairman, broadcasters are also an important part of our communities, promoting localism and contributing to a multitude of media voices. I've worked closely with you to ensure that local broadcasters receive fair treatment as part of this process, and I thank you again for your efforts in this regard. I look forward to continuing to work with you to ensure that everyone impacted by spectrum reallocation, including low-power stations, are treated fairly and equitably. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance for time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance for time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a minute.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for holding this hearing. Mr. Chairman, I am extremely pleased that this subcommittee has decided to act on one of our nation's most pressing public safety deficiencies, ensuring that there are reliable, interoperable communications among our valiant and heroic public safety and first responders. First, I'd like to welcome our public safety and first responders representatives, those who are here today, who are really true heroes from states across our nation and localities all across our nation. I salute you for all that you have done and continue to make your case persuasively and persistently for the immediate reallocation of D-block spectrum to public safety. I support you unconditionally in your endeavor to look forward to today's, and I look forward to today's markup in which we will debate and raise concerns about the workings of the Republican discussion draft, which is before us this very moment. Our American citizens must know that they will be as secure as possible in times of emergency and in times of crises. What we're setting out to accomplish as part of today's markup is how to best go about funding and deploying a nationwide interoperable wireless public safety network and clearing spectrum for public safety and commercial wireless broadband uses. As an early supporter of D-block allocation for the public safety sector, I will continue to work fervently through today's markup and in ensuring discussions between the majority and minority to ensure that we achieve those very aims and objectives. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. And the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, if she has any, because I had yielded to her part of my time, so you actually would be in order to have a minute if you want it. Or
I would yield it back to you for the.
Then I would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the 34 or so million people of California are facing 12% unemployment, but the 3 million people of San Diego County are facing 1 in 10 are unemployed. And this committee may be aware that a major issue of telecommunication is a major employer in San Diego County. So I'm glad to see this bill brought forward, but more importantly, the people of San Diego desperately need to see us bring this bill forward. Washington to finally set the guidelines, the rules, so we can move forward at creating the jobs and the opportunity that we talk about a lot here, but obviously don't do enough action. I appreciate you bringing this forward sooner rather than later, but mostly the people of San Diego County and that 1 in 10 that's unemployed. Thank you for bringing this forward, and hopefully we'll be able to set the rules, set the guidelines, and allow the private sector to create the miracle that we call economic growth to finally be legal again in this country. So thank you very much, and I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes from Colorado, the gentlelady, Ms. DeGette, for a minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This committee has an enormous opportunity to impact job creation and foster bipartisanship on the issues of spectrum policy and public safety broadband. As a co-sponsor of the Waxman-Eshoo Wireless Innovation and Public Safety Act, which most closely resembles S-911, the Senate Commerce Committee legislation that passed by a bipartisan 21-4 vote, I believe establishing a nonprofit national body is the most efficient way to build a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network for police and firefighters from California to Florida. In my home state of Colorado, the emergency responders have been working with the Public Safety Communications Research Program in Boulder, collaborating among local, state, and federal users on how to achieve an interoperable broadband network. This model offers a better way to integrate the technology already being developed and used. However, the threats we face and the response capability we need should not be pursued on a state-by-state basis. It's been 10 years since September 11th. We're behind in our work. We need to seize our common ground and unity of purpose, and we need to finally act in the wake of these attacks to be better prepared for these disasters. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady for her comments, and now we'll look to Mr. Bass from from New Hampshire, who I want to also thank for his good work and in speaking up for public safety and the effort that we've achieved.
Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for bringing this discussion draft to markup. This is a bill that will create real stimulus. It will reduce our nation's budget, our deficit significantly, and while at the same time creating a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network. I believe that the hard work of our chairman and others of this subcommittee has yielded a compromise that is a good one to reach the three balancing points that I outlined a second or two ago. I urge the adoption of this bill, and if there are differences that still exist between the two sides of the aisle, that they can be worked out between now and the time we bring it to full committee. And I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey, for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for calling today's markup on Jumpstarting Opportunity Through Broadband Spectrum Act, Jobs Act of 2011. Throughout this year, this subcommittee, as you so well pointed out in your opening remarks, has held 5 hearings on the issue of spectrum, and I'm glad that we're finally here today with a bill that represents solid policy for an industry that, even in these challenging times, is creating jobs. Most importantly, I believe that this legislation represents a balanced approach to the future of spectrum. In particular, Mr. Chairman, I commend you and your staff for working with me on the usage of existing infrastructure from the utilities companies. At the same time, as we move forward with this legislation, I hope to continue working with you to further clarify and improve utilities' access to the network. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation that will make spectrum available to the marketplace. It will help create jobs and reduce our federal deficit. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off by commending you for the hard work you've done threading the needle on this complex issue. The Jobs Act before us today is a balanced approach that reallocates the requested D-block to public safety, provides funding for a nationwide interoperable broadband network, frees up much-needed spectrum for commercial use, and is projected to generate billions of dollars to pay down our record-high national debt. In my experiences through Hurricane Katrina, I saw firsthand what our nation recognized in the aftermath of 9/11. Our first responders need and deserve a nationwide interoperable network. I applaud the eventual transfer of spectrum to meet the wireless broadband demands that are growing. During the repackaging process for broadcasters that elect not to participate, however, it's important that the FCC make every effort to maintain their existing signal contours. The net effect of a truly voluntary incentive auction process will be the creation of tens of thousands of private sector jobs, which our economy desperately needs. In fact, continued 4G build-out today is projected to provide between $25 to $50 billion in private sector infrastructure investment, and that translates into as many as 750,000 new American jobs. We can't risk stopping that powerful economic growth by kicking this issue down the road. I thank the chairman for bringing this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for a minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding the markup on the Jobs Act. I greatly appreciate the extensive hearings that the subcommittee has held to examine the very important issue of spectrum. It is critical that we get this right for innovation, job creation, and public safety. There is no reason that Congress shouldn't act on incentive auctions as soon as possible. Earlier this year, I introduced H.R. 1622, the Spectrum Innovation Act, which would authorize the FCC to conduct incentive auctions, thus unleashing much-needed airways for mobile broadband. I'm strongly supportive of the incentive auction provisions in this bill, and I appreciate the protections for broadcasters included in the legislation. These auctions can generate at least $15 billion, which will go to reducing our astronomical debt in this nation. For America to lead the world in technological advancement, the spectrum crunch cannot come to a breaking point. Approximately 100,000 plus new American jobs are at stake. America is and must continue to be the leader and innovator in this field. And, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for the hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky. If he has an opening statement, he does not. Gentleman from Illinois does not. I believe then everyone's been given an opportunity to offer an opening statement, and I thank you all for your participation. The chair now calls up the discussion draft and asks the clerk to report.
A discussion draft to promote job growth by making available additional spectrum for wireless broadband services, to reduce the deficit, to promote the deployment of nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there, Ms. Eshoo, do you want to offer the Democrat alternative at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have there is an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report that amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to discussion draft offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentle lady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this week, together with Mr. Waxman and 8 of our Democratic colleagues from this subcommittee, we introduced the Wireless Innovation and Public Safety Act of 2011. The significance of this legislation to our nation's economy, job creation, and the future of U.S. Innovation cannot be overstated. And I think every member on both sides of the aisle have stated the case quite eloquently over and over and over again. I offer this amendment as a substitute to the chairman's proposal. Our bill addresses three key areas in which I continue to have significant concerns. The first, the governance provisions for the public safety network. Two, the limitations on the FCC's ability to ensure auction rules preserve the public interest. And third, the treatment of unlicensed spectrum. I'm going to use my time to focus on unlicensed, which is so critical to entrepreneurs, innovators, and startups. And you see the chart, actually the chart should be the other way around. I want members to see it. I think it's great that the audience has had a glimpse, but they don't have a vote in this. So whomever put that up, if you could take it downstairs and turn it around so that
filling in
members
for
can see
Vanna
it.
White.
Okay. I don't know whether they can see it from there. Good, very good. Thank you, Diane. Whether we recognize it or not, unlicensed is a part of our daily lives. As the chart highlights, unlicensed spectrum is enabling small businesses and entrepreneurs to innovate. From wireless baby monitors to cordless phones, security alarm systems, and home Wi-Fi, unlicensed has and will continue to change the way we communicate and live our lives. It's also removing the barriers to entry that exist with licensed spectrum. Over 20 years ago, the FCC opened up the 2.4 gigahertz band for unlicensed use. No one could have imagined the possibilities that would have emerged. The possibilities for extending that innovation for unlicensed applications and services into the TV band are limitless, with some estimating the economic value of unlicensed spectrum at $16 to $37 billion per year. I don't think we can afford to overlook both the short and long-term benefits of unlicensed spectrum. During our in-district work periods, I make a point to go out and meet with the employees of startups in my district. One in particular, EYE, EYE-FI, was highly instructive to me, and I think it would be to everyone on the committee as well. The common message I heard from them, and so many of the others that I met with. Now, these are startups. These are small businesses, 20, 30, 42, 50 employees. I mean, truly small businesses that I met with, is that Congress should not shut the door on opportunities to free up new unlicensed spectrum. This amendment includes language that will give the FCC the flexibility to make spectrum available for unlicensed use after an incentive auction. The chairman's proposal would prohibit the FCC from setting aside unlicensed spectrum for any incentive auction, including an incentive auction of the TV band. So there's a big difference here. So, Mr. Chairman, many of my Democratic colleagues intend to discuss the other aspects of this amendment, of our amendment, and why each is essential to our nation's future. And I hope our discussion will allow us to bridge our differences and provide a path toward a bipartisan bill. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back the balance of her time. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. And let me start with this discussion about unlicensed. We have come a long way on this issue. I'm actually a fan of unlicensed spectrum usage. We started out with a proposal that because of this huge value you just referenced, $30–40 billion worth, thought maybe there is an auction model that could be used so that these companies that will benefit from the unlicensed spectrum could actually pay something for it. These are some of the country's biggest, most successful companies in some cases, and some of them are the smallest, startups, and great innovators. And so we looked at a model that originally had come from some economists at the FCC and decided, after many discussions with Democrats and others in the wireless community, that model really didn't work. So we dropped that. But one of the things that we held as a core principle was if we were going to ask the taxpayers, in effect, to use auction proceeds to pay for the clearing of broadcast spectrum, we should not set aside a chunk of that for others to go use for free. And that is really the philosophical and fundamental differences between our bills and this provision. And so what we're saying is the FCC, you can't go carve out for primary use a chunk of this spectrum we're trying to free up and pay to free up. However, after the auction, if there are, as I think Commissioner McDowell referred to them, carpet remnants, if you will, if there are little bits and pieces and blocks of spectrum as there are today available, they would still have the authority to allow unlicensed use for that. It's just not that we're going to carve out a chunk, that we're going to pay to carve out off the broadcast spectrum and then say to the unlicensed world, you're going to have your own chunk here nationwide of this very valuable public spectrum to do with as you want. So it would score, I believe, $1 billion is what's at issue here for the taxpayers. $1 billion if we go the route of the Democrat alternative. And yet already there are 675 megahertz of spectrum below 6 gigs dedicated for unlicensed use. It doesn't even include the white spaces, which we leave intact. And they will remain there even after repacking. There's 100 megahertz more that's available for licensed use, unlicensed use, below 6 gigs. So there, I believe this is correct. There is more unlicensed available today than there is licensed, under 6 gigahertz. And so the bill does not stop the FCC from creating more in certain circumstances. It does not prevent the FCC from allocating some of the cleared spectrum for unlicensed use on a secondary, shared, non-interfering basis like the current 5 gig Wi-Fi spectrum, nor does it prevent the FCC from allocating for unlicensed use on a primary dedicated basis other spectrum not cleared from by this legislation. It just prevents the FCC from giving away any of the spectrum we're going to we're going through such expense to clear, because we think the higher value there for the taxpayer is not to give away the $1 billion, and instead to make this available for wireless broadband build out. Are there other members on my side seeking recognition? If not, I would recognize the gentlelady from California, yield to her as part of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this whole issue of unlicensed allocation versus licensed, some supporters of the Republican proposal have argued that there are currently over 600 megahertz of spectrum allocated for unlicensed use. Now, that number distorts the fact that the vast majority of those unlicensed frequencies are available only above 5 gigahertz in frequencies that are shared with military radar and have poor propagation characteristics. So that means the airwaves that are traveling in those bands don't penetrate buildings, and they're not useful for rural broadband.
Reclaiming
yes?
my time, because I'd like to address some of these. There's 83.5 megahertz of spectrum used for Wi-Fi between the 2400 and 2483.5 meg band. That's where Wi-Fi is. I would defer to our counsel, Mr. Rettel.
That's correct, sir.
And on unlicensed PCS, there's 10 megahertz in the 1920 and 1930 megs.
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
And in terms of white spaces that are available for out there and unlicensed, what's available?
Those are available in the UHF television band between 512 megahertz and 698 megahertz.
And in the 900 meg unlicensed?
It's also available for unlicensed use.
My time has expired. Is there anyone on the Democrat side seeking time? Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the substitute offered by Ms. Eshoo. For the reasons outlined in my opening statement, the Democratic substitute is preferable to the Republican discussion draft in several respects. The most important issues involve the treatment of unlicensed spectrum, which we've already started to discuss, public safety network governance, and auction eligibility and funding levels. First, on this unlicensed spectrum issue, the substitute does not mandate that the FCC allocate broadcast spectrum for super Wi-Fi, but we believe it's important the agency retain the flexibility to do so if necessary. Unlicensed spectrum has given rise to countless wireless devices and services, and we saw, maybe the audience didn't see, a list of a lot of things that have been used, have used this spectrum, such as baby monitors, garage door openers, connected alarm systems, smart grid monitoring. In fact, unlicensed wireless technologies have become a critical part of our national infrastructure. Wireless healthcare, for example, is 80% unlicensed. Smart grid communications are 70% unlicensed. And American businesses utilize unlicensed to develop their own innovative solutions to provide better service. UPS, for example, uses unlicensed spectrum to manage its fleet management systems. ExxonMobil uses unlicensed for its SpeedPass payment system. Walmart uses unlicensed RFID tags for inventory management. And unlicensed is also a critical part of wireless carrier business models. Studies have shown that mobile data offloaded to Wi-Fi from the networks of mobile operators is expected to reach 90% by 2015. Another issue, we don't want to preclude the supercarriers, Verizon and AT&T, from bidding, but we do want to make sure that the FCC can ensure that competition survives. We've reached out to numerous smaller and mid-sized wireless carriers about the Republican language, and they're very concerned and see this as an effort by AT&T and Verizon to maximize their spectrum dominance. We should retain the status quo. We don't expect that the FCC will restrict big companies from bidding, but there could be future situations when it's prudent to do so, and the substitute would allow the FCC to do so in those extreme cases. Governance issues in the Republican discussion draft raise concerns. It is unprecedented and inappropriate to provide private company with the FCC license for public safety spectrum, much less highly valuable spectrum of value upwards of $5.5 billion. Even with checks on the permitted uses of this license, a profit-motivated private company could find ways to monetize the value of this license in its business dealings. The draft also implements policies that repeat mistakes of the past. The critical need to build a nationwide interoperable broadband public safety network reflects the failure. Despite decades of effort of individual jurisdictions to effectively coordinate with each other to make this happen, by having each state build out its own network, the draft ignores this history while putting at risk billions of additional federal dollars in the process. According to the Congressional Research Service, since 2001, at least $3.5 billion in federal funds has been dedicated toward achieving public safety communications interoperability. The draft would provide only slightly more than that amount to construct 50 separate state networks based on a far more technically complex technology and where no readily available standard exists to interconnect those networks. The draft does not allow for network access by federal first responders, agencies like the FBI, and thus ignores the critical role played by federal entities in emergency response, a gaping hole that could cost lives. This also removes the benefit of sharing federal infrastructure for network build, especially in very rural and border areas where federal assets are located. For these reasons, I urge support for the Democratic substitute, and I want to point out, on going back to this white space issue, our staff talked to a lot of the experts, and they feel that following an incentive auction of the broadcast television spectrum, the amount of white spaces or empty channels would be greatly reduced. And then when you come to markets where there are already a lot of television channels, such as New York or Los Angeles, the white spaces are expected to disappear. That means there may not be any spectrum left for unlicensed devices in the television band. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there members seeking recognition? Mr. Stearns is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask counsel a couple questions. You know, a lot of this discussion has been about the procedures in the bill and the difference. Let me ask counsel, has CBO scored the Democrat bill?
Not to my knowledge. The closest thing to the structure that is seen in the Democratic amendment in the nature of a substitute was the structure that appears in the Senate version S911. That bill scored as a savings for deficit reduction of around $6 billion, and the structure that was created to govern public safety scored as losing $1 billion over the first 10 years of its existence.
And the CBO scored our bill, the Republican that we have, the main bill?
We have not received an official score, but staff discussions with CBO indicate that we will get in the range of $15 billion for deficit reduction.
So to review, you're saying the bill we have here is likely to score at $15 billion for taxpayers, and the Democrat bill would score at $6.5 billion. Is that a fair?
The Senate version scored at $6.5 billion.
Senate version. And is this that much different than the Senate?
They have fewer spends than the Senate version, but the structure for public safety remains, the portion that caused the $1 billion loss in the Senate version remains here.
Let me ask you a little bit about, in the Democrat bill, the the Public Safety Trust Corporation. How much a year is this going to have to be funded by the taxpayers? This is a not-for-profit corporation that's set up under the Democrat bill, and it's funded every year, is it?
It is unclear how much it will actually cost over the course of the 10-year CBO scoring window.
So over 10 years, this not-for-profit corporation is set up much like, would it be fair to say it's an analogy like we're set up with Amtrak or we set up with other not-for-profits?
I would say it's a fair analogy in that it is also a federally created not-for-profit corporation.
Right. So it's a federally created not-for-profit. But at this point, it's not clear in the Democrat bill how much this would cost every year.
That is correct.
Now, in the Republican bill, there's an administrator to do essentially coordination between, as I understand, the 50 states. And this administrator would be funded by the taxpayers?
It would be funded out of auction receipts from the auctions authorized by the Jobs Act.
Okay, so the main difference, of course, the two bills is that a federal not-for-profit organization is set up and be funded every year, whereas we're delegating it to the states. The administrator will be paid on the federal level to coordinate between all the states based upon the sale of the auction. Is that fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Will the gentleman yield to...
let me just, I'm almost finished here. Another major difference between the two bills is that the unlicensed auction of the spectrum, the taxpayers would get paid, whereas on the Democrat bill, it'd be essentially gifted to people. Is that correct?
License that is allocated as a primary allocation for unlicensed instead of being auctioned would be funds that could have been recovered through auctions. Yes, sir.
A Democrat plan, though, whereas the Republican plan, we get paid, the taxpayers get paid, but under the Democrat plan, it is set aside, and the taxpayers don't get reimbursed. Is that?
Under the Democrat plan, the FCC would retain the authority to give away as much unlicensed spectrum as it deems in the public interest.
Now, a larger question is, how would they decide who to give it to? Would they give it to small people or big people? Are they talking about what's the criteria on the Democrat bill for the FCC to decide who to give that to?
The FCC retains full discretion to decide how much.
So there's nothing in the bill to decide who they're going to give it to? This is very valuable. This unlicensed spectrum is very valuable, so I think we as members of Congress got to decide. We're giving the FCC this authority, but this authority allows them at their discretion, at their will, to give to whomever they want this very valuable spectrum. Is that a fair estimate?
Unlicensed spectrum as a matter of law is not given to someone per se, but it would give the FCC the authority to forego selling a license for that spectrum, which would generate money for the Treasury, in favor of giving away spectrum for general use.
So just to take perhaps one scenario would be the FCC would have this unlicensed spectrum. They would hold it in trust, and then over a period of time they would give it to whomever they want. That, as I understand, in the bill allows them to do that. Is that correct?
That is one situation that could arise, yes.
Okay. I'd be glad with the balance of my time to give the gentleman from California.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify, in the SU substitute, there's a limit, a maximum of $50 million for administrative expenses for this nonprofit committee. You said it could go up to $1 billion. Are you aware of that limit in the bill?
It also, I'm not, but I'll go back and look at it. I'm also aware that the Democratic amendment in the nature of a substitute permits the corporation to assess user fees in order to collect funds directly from
reclaiming my time. I'll close with this, Mr. Chairman. So I think that's something else. You're saying that in the Democrat bill they're allowed to tax with these user fees.
They're allowed to collect from end users that use the network fees in the same way that a commercial entity charges.
And the amount of this user fee that they can assess? Is there any limit on that?
Gentleman's time is expiring.
If you can't just answer the question, Mr. Chairman, then I'm complete.
If you give me a second, we'll have to look it up.
Sure. I think it's important to
Unless
know
the
for all.
Democratic counsel would like to answer the question.
I think, Mr. Chairman,
We'll do that. We'll move on while they look that up, and I'll recognize the recognize the gentleman. Mr. Markey for 5.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Let me begin by just saying that I want to praise the Republicans for including now a reallocation of the D block spectrum to public safety rather than auctioning it. I think that's an improvement in your legislation. But at the same time, let me say that the Republican draft does include a significant limitation on the FCC's future authority to design the auctions. Under current law, the FCC has broad authority to craft auction rules in the public interest. The agency has used that authority to ensure that communications markets remain competitive and that the spectrum is not concentrated in the hands of only one or two providers. Democrats are not saying that the largest companies should be prohibited from bidding. We want them to bid, and we want them to spend lots of money, which goes into the public treasuries on licenses to serve the American public and fund our public safety networks. But we need to preserve the expert agency's ability to provide and to consider the market conditions and so that they remain vigorous, competitive marketplace, that they are Darwinian, that they induce paranoia, that they ensure innovation, and that they not suffer from the complacency of only having one or two companies that have a monopoly or a duopoly, because that in the long run reduces the amount of innovation, reduces our chances of being number one, looking over our shoulders at number 2 and 3 and 4 in the world. That's who we have to be, and only by creating Darwinian conditions. So simply put, we have no idea what the wireless marketplace will look like in future years, yet the Republican bill will ensure that the FCC does not have the ability to prohibit future wireless monopolies from emerging. And at the end of the day, that's what makes us number one. It's that we're an idea economy. We have to be the idea economy. That's what differentiates us from India, from China, from other countries in the world, that we get the new ideas first. You do not get that by having a monopoly or duopoly marketplace.
But gentlemen,
that's the just let me finish, because I am limited, if I may. So I just think the governance structure for the public safety network is weak, it's cumbersome, it lacks the necessary uniformity. It limits the FCC's authority to craft the auction rules in the public interest, and it prohibits allocating spectrum from incentive auctions for unlicensed use. That's what Ranking Member Eshu's substitute seeks to remedy. It goes right to the heart of what it is that's made us special since we moved over the 200 megahertz in 1993 out of this committee. We created a paranoia-inducing marketplace out there. We moved rapidly from analog to digital. We moved rapidly from narrowband to broadband. We did it all in 3 or 4 years, and that's what has given us the lead in the world. We don't hear about Nokia anymore. We don't hear about these other technologies from other countries. People hear about our technologies, our innovators. So just by creating that kind of an environment, that's what's changed the world. And at the same time, the Democratic substitute just lays out, and I thank them for including this language, that for television broadcasters it's voluntary. And I thank Mrs. Eshu and Mr. Waxman for including that language in the Democratic substitute that we're now considering. But that's my point, Mr. Chairman, if I may say that to you, and I'd be glad to yield to you on the larger point
that we have to give the FCC that authority to have the discretion to protect this marketplace and keep it competitive.
And that's, I appreciate the gentleman yielding, because I'd like to ask the council, I think there's a misunderstanding of what our bill does and does not do. And council, is it not correct that our bill, while it makes sure that everybody can participate in the auction, it does not take away the FCC's ability on a market-by-market basis to exercise their public interest standard requirements?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Section 309A of the Act requires the FCC to make a public interest finding before granting the license at the conclusion of an auction and the choosing of a successful bidder.
And on the other issue of a monopoly, is there not also still all of the law there in terms of Federal Trade Commission and all equal justice?
If the gentleman would yield, just so I can respond to counsel, the language in the Republican bill is ambiguous, it's vague, it's not clear in terms of the FCC's authority, and that's why we're concerned about it. Okay, we have to make sure that the expert agency can ensure that there is a competitive marketplace here. And the language that is in the Republican substitute does not provide that clarity. It would be litigated from here to Kingdom Come, and we all know that the smallest companies are vindicated posthumously, okay, when they're battling corporations with hundreds of lawyers. We have to protect that smaller entry company. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from
the last word.
Nebraska is recognized. And would he yield to me for just
Sure.
Second.
I yield to the chairman.
Thank you. Council, since this is an issue that is clearly before us right now and is of great importance, would you mind reviewing the language regarding the FCC's authority related to public interest?
Sure. Section 105 of the Jobs Act amends Section 309J of the Communications Act to add new paragraph 17, certain conditions on auction participation prohibited, and states that the Commission may not impose any condition on eligibility for participation in a system of competitive bidding under this subsection that is not related to the qualifications of an applicant under Section 308B or Section 310. Sections 308B and Section 310 state the financial, citizenship, and ethical qualifications of potential bidders. And the language here, by conditioning this on eligibility for participation in a system of competitive bidding, would only apply to letting someone bid in the auction. Once the provisionally winning bidders have been chosen, the system of competitive bidding has ended and Section 309A takes over, which is the public interest determination that the FCC must make prior to granting a license to the provisionally winning bidder.
And does anything in the Republican alternative affect that section?
No.
So we do not affect the FCC's underlying authority when it comes to public interest standards in the market. We're not changing that. There's no vague language there because there's no language affecting it, correct?
Right.
Correct. Nothing affects 309A.
Yeah.
I yield back to the gentleman.
I reclaim my time, and sure, I'll get to my statement in a while, but I'll proudly yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Okay. Well, and that's just to ask counsel, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Traditionally, the FCC has structured auctions in which one block of spectrum auction may be set aside to promote entrepreneurial and small business access to spectrum licenses. The FCC has also imposed conditions in the past limiting the number of blocks for which licenses could be won in the auction by any one applicant. Is that clear in the language here that the Republicans have in their bill, that the FCC can still do that under the Republican bill?
With the compound question, sir, which one would you like the answer to?
Both.
Okay. With respect to the entrepreneurial language, it's my understanding the FCC has not used the pioneer's preference in decades, and that hasn't been an issue. With respect to whether or not they can, would you repeat the second part of the question?
The second part of the question has imposed conditions in the past limiting the number of blocks for which licenses could be won in an auction into any one applicant so that competitive conditions are maintained in the marketplace. Do they retain that ability
the FCC,
under the majority's legislation we consider today?
The FCC would not be able to structure the auction in a way that prohibited participation. They would, however, still be able to prohibit undue concentration of licenses through the public interest test under 309A.
So you're saying there is, though, now a limitation in their bill in terms of who the participants can be in any particular auction. Is that correct?
Yes, they cannot impose a condition on eligibility for participation.
Yeah, I think that goes right to how big can one company.
I'm going to reclaim my time.
I thank you.
Mr. Terry controls time.
All right. Thank you. So we don't interfere or mandate, in essence, small business set-asides as a condition proceeding at the auctions, but we preserve the public interest ability and obligation of the FCC because we don't change that law.
Yes, sir. And more recently,
right.
for small businesses, the FCC has used bidding credits as opposed to set-asides.
And
could you move the microphone a little closer, David? Thank you.
You got it.
Real quick with my minute, I do want to get back to Mr. Stern's FCC user fees and whether or not there's limits within there. How are there controls on the FCC on the user fees?
About the Democrat amendment in the nature of the substitute?
Yes.
In the Democrats' amendment...
So answer for Mr. Stern's question is what I'm saying.
Yes. The administrative fees are limited to sufficient to cover the cost of the corporation, but nothing limits the corporation's ability to use that as a way to get funds above and beyond the $50 million cap that is imposed on their direct appropriations.
That's interesting. Thank you. I'll yield back my 13 seconds.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members? Ms. Matsui is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support the SU substitute amendment. This amendment is one based on sound policy, one that will finally provide public safety with a nationwide interoperable network that they need and deserve, and one that will continue to foster American innovation and ingenuity, all while maintaining sound fiscal discipline. We believe that governance is paramount and critical to ensure America's first responders have an efficient and effective nationwide interoperable network. We've held several subcommittee hearings this year on spectrum, and the SU substitute amendment is a true reflection of those hearings, responsibly taking into account prevailing views and needs of America's first responders and America's innovators. During many of these hearings, I remain focused on the need to responsibly govern any nationwide public safety interoperable network. I was asking the questions: who would govern and oversee the public safety network that will ultimately possess significant responsibilities? I was also asking the question, how can we ensure taxpayer money is spent wisely and effectively so America's first responders end up with a network they need and deserve? I was asking those questions because it will have the responsibility over highly valuable D-block spectrum, billions of dollars of public funding, not to mention needing to ensure the success of this vitally important network for first responders. The SU substitute amendment answers these questions. Among other provisions, it will establish a private, nonprofit, public safety broadband corporation as a national governance vehicle that ensures the primary goal of achieving a nationwide level of interoperability for a nation's first responders, while ensuring the fiscal responsibility and accountability called for. Unfortunately, the majority bill falls short on a responsible governance structure. Instead, it gives significant powers to a single private company without any meaningful oversight to manage 50 separate state networks and make many numerous decisions on every state contract and aspects of the network deployments. In fact, state and local government organizations and public safety have voiced their concerns with the governance structure outlined in the majority bill. That should give us all pause, considering they are the major stakeholders and have every reason to ensure the success of a nationwide public safety system. We should not delegate the core responsibilities to a private, profit-driven company which may or may not be beholden to shareholders, especially in the absence of any real oversight over its decisions with regard to public safety interests in protecting this country. Simply put, governance is a linchpin of the public safety broadband network that will determine success or failure. It must be done right from the outset. It must protect taxpayers' monies and prove to be effective and efficient. Mr. Chairman, it's my hope that we'll provide public safety with interoperable capabilities they need and deserve to protect our nation during challenging times. The SU substitute amendment does just that, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back the balance of her time. Does
I yield it back. Sorry.
did you want to yield?
Yes, I would like to yield to the gentleman.
I think there was a minute 37 left.
I thank the gentlewoman. This is a very, very, very important part of this legislation. We have on our side congratulated the majority for moving on the allocation of the D block, and that's significant. And we are congratulating and grateful for that all over again. But most frankly, if the governance model is not right, it ain't going to work. Now, there's a reason for the nonpartisan organizations of the Public Safety Alliance, the National Governors Association, the National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, the International City-County Management Association, and many others have endorsed the Democratic proposal. And a good amount of that support comes in and around the governance model. The governance model. This needs to be national in scope with important participation from state and local jurisdictions. We stayed away from something that was bureaucratic. We examined what the Senate had to offer. And I think if we don't get this governance portion of the legislation right, then most frankly, we're going to fail on the public safety front, because that's the body that is going to oversee the implementation of establishing a national interoperable telecommunications network for public safety people across the country. So we need to work on this, Mr. Chairman, and I don't think that the underlying legislation really meets the high standard that is required here.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan to yield to the chair, perhaps? That's what I thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that opportunity to yield your time.
I appreciate that. And I would like to ask the council, does the Republican draft and the way the administrator position structured allow the administrator to set policy? Or is policy under the draft set by the board?
Policy is set by the board, Mr. Chairman.
And what could you explain from the draft any further obligations under the proposed law of the Republicans would put in place that administrator would have?
The role of the administrator is largely to ensure that the policy set by the board is followed through the contracts, negotiations, and requests for proposals done on a state-by-state basis by the state broadband offices established under the Act. So once a state has conducted a negotiation and has a proposed contract to build the broadband network for public safety within their state, they are told to submit that form to the administrator to ensure that the state plan complies with national interoperability standards.
And are there other models in the government that use an administrator concept similar to this?
There are others that use an administrator model. This one is, has taken into account some of the lessons learned from other administrator models. Within public safety, there's an administrator model used for the 800 megahertz rebanding. That project has gone on a while, and a lot of the lessons that have been learned from that process have been incorporated into the Republican draft.
I will recognize Mr. Terry now and yield the remainder of my time to him since he was so generous. I yield back to Mr. Rogers.
I'd like
Rogers,
to reclaim
would
my
you
time,
yield me?
Mr. Chairman, and yield it to Mr. Terry.
Yeah, on the issue of governance, and I'd like to ask the chairman here. Now, in the state of Nebraska, our Public Safety Commission has done what I would think a great job in being able to use a variety of technologies to make sure that the interoperability has progressed. Would this shut down or preempt what states have already done successfully?
The gentleman will yield. The answer would be no. In fact, it is designed to build on and use
let me
that
ask
and
it a
leverage.
different way. Let me ask the gentlelady from California with her amendment. Would this preempt what states have already done? How would this national structure work with what states and municipalities and counties have done when they've been working together? Because there are success stories out there.
Well, I think that that it's a very strong governance model in that we know that it has to be national, but there's a very strong element of state and local that is bound to it. Very interestingly, in the Republican discussion draft, we believe it's a relatively weak board with all of the resources, the staffing, the facilities, and the administrative support provided by the FCC. Surprise, surprise. You want the FCC to do it. The FCC doesn't want to. So
all right, I'm going to reclaim. And Mr. Rogers, do you want to? Yeah, I yield back my time.
Yield back my time. Is there any other member that seeks time? I'd yield back my time to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members seeking recognition, or are we ready to proceed to a vote on the substitute? If there are no other members seeking recognition, the chair now asks for a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The noes appear to have it, and the noes have it. The minority would like a roll call vote, so a roll call vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Terry?
No.
Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Shimkus? Mrs. Bonomack? Mrs. Bonomack votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray votes no. Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass votes no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Christensen? Mr. Towns? Mr. Towns votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Waxman?
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Chairman Walden?
No.
Chairman Walden votes no.
Are there other members who have not voted? Mr. Shimkus?
No. Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Are there other members who have not voted? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 8 ayes, 16 nays.
8 ayes, 16 nays. The amendment is not approved. Are there bipartisan amendments to the Jobs Act?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray.
Mr. Chairman, I have the honor to have an amendment at the desk with Chairman Dingell.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Bilbray of California and Mr. Dingell of Michigan.
The gentleman from California is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a pretty extensive amendment here, and really it is 2 sentences. I guess We'll all remember the classic movie American Graffiti, where Richard Dreyfuss was running around looking for Wolfman Jack and where he was transmitting his radio show. And one of the characters talk about, well, he's on a hill in Tijuana, broadcasting from there, and he covers the whole world. Well, I happen to have grown up in a neighborhood that looked up at the hill where those broadcasting stations exist. And the issue of cross-border, international cross-border transmission and interference and problems is very extensive. It's something that to this day still hasn't been addressed, from everything from Wolfman Jack to having Baja Cellular confiscate calls in the San Diego region. And it's all we're asking for. I've had the honor to work with Mr. Dinger on this, is that we make sure that in this bill that we address those issues, be they in Tijuana or be they in Detroit. I think this is something that the federal government has not only the right but the responsibility to specifically address, not just for those of us along the frontiers, but across the entire country. And I would ask that we consider this amendment. And at this time, I would, if the gentleman like, I'd yield to my colleague from Michigan.
I thank my good friend, and I'm very happy to join him in sponsorship of this legislation. I begin, Mr. Chairman, by commending you for holding this markup, and I'd also like to commend you for the progress you've made in your discussion draft toward addressing issues that affect public safety and broadcasters, ensuring our nation's first responders have the resources they need to protect Americans, and making sure that our constituents still have access to free over-the-air broadcasting are goals of the utmost importance. I do not doubt your commitment to seeing them to a successful resolution, and I thank you and your staff for your willingness to consider all manner of suggestions to achieve this end. The amendment that my friend and colleague, Mr. Bill Bray of California, and I are offering will clarify the Federal Communications Commission may not reorganize broadcast frequencies without coordinating with Canada and Mexico. I've fought for many months to get information from the Commission about precisely this issue, and unfortunately to no avail. The Commission has been secretive and, quite honestly, has given me the impression of some dishonesty by the way it has conducted itself on this matter. The Commission has been totally unwilling to grant my requests for information. Gives me dark suspicions that viewers in the border areas, all along the Mexican-U.S. border and all along the Canadian-U.S. border and the Alaska-U.S. border, Alaska-Canadian border, have real reason to fear that we will lose or find our television signals degraded or indeed worse. Our amendment will prevent that, and I urge all my colleagues to support that. I'd like to now request an answer to a question from Council. Council, this only requires a yes or no answer. Does the...
There's a new technique.
Well, let's hope it works, Mr. Chairman. Does this amendment require the United States to complete the coordination process with Canada and Mexico before the FCC reassigns channels for the remaining broadcasters?
Yes.
Thank you, Counsel. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the committee report reflect this exchange. And I want to thank you and my colleagues for your courtesy. I also want to thank my colleague from California for his leadership and his help and his friendship. I would simply observe, if your district is anywhere near any of the national borders of the United States with any of our neighboring nations, you have a strong interest in seeing to it that this amendment is adopted, and that failure to do so may strip your people of proper service or degrade the service that you receive. And it will comfort this committee to know that the FCC will be compelled to do something they've indicated no inclination to do up to this time, and that is to see to it that border states and the broadcasters and listeners in those border states receive proper service. I commend my colleague, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you. You are proving today that when the regular order is followed, good consequences are likely to follow. I thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. Just as even though Mr. Dreyfus never did find the elusive blonde running around in the T-Bird, I hope that the quest that we have of equal protection for our communication capabilities along the border will be a lot more successful than Mr. Dreyfus was. Thank you much. I yield back.
I recognize the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the Chairman Emeritus for what he is offering with Mr. Bill Bray. It's very important for those that live along the borders that they not in any way, shape, or form lose the broadcasts that they are entitled to in our country. After all, these are the public airwaves, and I think that they've added something to the legislation that all of us can and should support, reflecting the importance and the substance of the amendment. And I yield back.
Chair recognizes himself to say we support the amendment. We thank the gentleman from San Diego and the gentleman from Detroit for bringing this legislation forward, or who represents the Detroit market at least, for bringing this amendment forward. And if there's no further discussion, we'd be prepared to go for a vote. The question is on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes clearly have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments to come before the bill? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Stearns of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, if the Jumpstart Opportunity with Broadband Spectrum Act of 2011 is signed into law, we are giving the Federal Trade Commission the authority to create a spectrum auction that will determine the fate of our wireless future. And while the contours of this auction will largely be crafted at the staff level, the commissioners will supervise, guide, and shape the ultimate policy. Although the legal and policy advisors to the commissioners continue to serve an important role, I believe it is time that we also allow commissioners to appoint an engineer to inform their decisions. A few months ago, Verizon President McAdam emphasized that current government policy causes a spectrum crunch that we find ourselves in today. In the past, the FCC auctions carved out spectrum into too small of chunks to be usable or encouraged entities to buy spectrum, hold it, and then flip it in the next 10 years. My colleagues, if we are to provide the FCC with the authority to hold auctions, we must arm it with the appropriate tools so that they can succeed. Therefore, this simple amendment incorporates my bipartisan bill, H.R. 2102, and the FCC Commissioners' Technical Resource Enhancement Act into the spectrum legislation we have before us today. Importantly, my bill is already co-sponsored by my colleague Bobby Rush, Jerry McInerney, and Tom Petrie of Wisconsin. Specifically, this bill modifies existing laws so that each commissioner may hire an additional staff member, an electrical engineer, or a computer scientist to provide an in-depth technical consultation as well as an interface with the Office of Engineering and Technology and other commissioner technical staff. Currently, the statute limits each commissioner to appoint 3 professional assistants, which typically, my friends, are legal advisors. By having both legal and technical advisors, we'll provide the FCC commissioners with the necessary, I think, balance, staff experience to properly address increasingly complex technical and legal matters. Importantly, CBO has already estimated that the net budgetary impact of the bill would be insignificant. The language only permits commissioners to hire an engineer. It does not require a commissioner to do so. Moreover, fees collected by the commission would offset the compensation for this type of employee. So my colleagues, my purpose with this amendment is to provide the necessary support to the agency that we are entrusting with determining the future of our country's spectrum policy. I would hope all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would ultimately support this amendment. However, after talking with the staff and talking with the chairman, I understand that there is some concern about its jurisdiction and its applicability under this process. So under those circumstances, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you in the future, and I decided that in this case and under these circumstances, I'm happy to withdraw this amendment this time so we can work in the future to help the full committee in its markup, and more importantly, to give the FCC the opportunity so each commissioner can appoint an electrical engineer or computer science to help him in this very innovative age we're moving into with new technology. And I thank the chairman.
Would the gentleman
I would be
yield?
glad to yield.
I want to thank the gentleman for the thinking that's embedded in the amendment that you're withdrawing. I raised the point that you are making in the amendment when the FCC testified, and because I thought it was important, along with you and what you laid out, that they have this opportunity. But I was very surprised that they turned it down. The FCC said that they thought that they had the resources that were necessary, and that you and what was embedded in my question to them had really essentially been taken care of. So I appreciate your raising it, and because they really should have access to what you outlined. But just to enlarge on the discussion here, they thought that they had what they needed. So I just offer that, and thank you for raising it. But we were both thinking the same thing.
Yeah,
We
I would
said
just
no.
say to the gentlelady, if you ask a lot of lawyers if you need an engineer, they'll probably say no.
No, this was specifically on the. No, this was specifically on what you just outlined.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with lawyers.
All right.
I asked very specifically about technologists and what you raised, and that was their answer.
Well, I
So,
thank the
thank
encouragement from the gentlelady.
Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read.
At this time,
title
I
of the
will
amendment.
reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves point of order.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, providing for the needs of public safety and doing what we can through the incentives auctions process to tame growing U.S. deficits are our overarching priorities. With a national employment rate above 9%, we cannot afford to put all of our eggs in one basket. The spectrum policy approach that Congress decides to take will affect the number of jobs that we can create, as well as the additional domestic economic growth we can generate. In doing so, we must not and cannot afford to foreclose smaller companies and entities from meaningfully participating in future FCC spectrum auctions. Further concentration of media and communications ownership is not the antidote to job losses and a shrinking GDP and a shrinking economy. Nor will these gains be based on the expectancy that government should make as much new spectrum as possible unlicensed. Our commercial end game can not only be about making sure that as many of our country's wireless subscribers can get 4G service, or that broadcasters get the fairest shake possible and make the most money possible. These measures may make for larger subscriber bases, but they aren't the rifle shots necessary for curing our job woes that slick commercials and some self-serving interest groups may want the American public to believe. Undoubtedly, these are very important goals that will be instrumental in ensuring that as much spectrum is cleared and reallocated as possible for public safety and commercial purposes. But, Mr. Chairman, we must see this time as a real opportunity to create jobs and to grow our economy in the process. Rolling out new wireless broadband services and consumer wireless devices that operate in these new licensed and unlicensed spectrum bands may help to catalyze some job creation and make us more productive in our daily lives. But the statistics clearly show that small business jobs and hiring will propel most of our future job growth and will put our nation back on its feet and our American workers back to working. That is why I took the time to draft an amendment, which I will be withdrawing, Mr. Chairman, to institute a tax certificate program that will provide incentives for broadcasters who decide to relinquish their over-the-air TV licenses to invest in small and disadvantaged businesses in the communications and information services sector. In coming days, I'll be working very actively to support, seeking support among my esteemed colleagues on this committee from both sides of the aisle and with others for my proposal. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman withdraw his amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there other members seeking recognition for amendments? Gentleman from let's go to Mr. Rogers. We'll recognize gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Rogers of Michigan.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we look to build out across the country, and there's some concern about the security of those networks, and this legislation is intended to prevent companies that have been deemed, quote, a national security concern by a federal agency from participating in or contracting with the federal government to build out public safety networks. The build-out of our nationwide public safety network is too important for a company with a questionable intention to come in and underbid a project for the sole purpose of having access to those networks. We are suffering death by 1,000 cuts right now from cyber espionage in a way that is shocking and breathtaking and, quite frankly, intolerable from nation states around the world. And when they do that, it jeopardizes nearly every sector of our economy. These cyber espionage attacks result in massive losses of private sector intellectual property and sensitive government information. Senior intelligence officials estimate that $1 trillion with a T dollars worth of intellectual property and government information is stolen every single year as we go into 2012 through cyber espionage. I urge your immediate support of this amendment and to protect the security of our nationwide networks.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be honored to yield.
I want to thank the gentleman for offering this very important amendment. Our committee is, and its work is enhanced by having Mr. Rogers here all of these years, but also in his added responsibility as being chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. As a former member, having just finished 8 years there, I know very well the depths and the breadth of this issue. It is a national security issue. Our effort here is strengthened with this amendment. I fully support it, and I thank him for offering it, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and I want to thank her service on the Intelligence Committee, and I think you also bring that same experience to this committee that is incredibly valuable, and I'd yield to the chairman.
Yield. I want to thank both of you for speaking in favor of this amendment. Mr. Rogers, you're for bringing it. I'm fully supportive of it and would encourage members on both sides of the aisle to be supportive of this amendment, and I would yield back to you. And
seeking any other members seeking time? I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition on this amendment? If not, the question before us is approving the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Chair recognizes himself for purposes of an amendment. The clerk will report the manager's amendment clarification, AMD02.
Manager's amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Walden of Oregon.
Chair recognizes himself to discuss the amendment. This amendment merely makes technical changes. It clarifies the effect on low-power TV usage rights and includes all reasonable costs for cable, clarifying facility, citing language. This is a technical amendment only in virtually all measure, and I don't believe there's opposition to it. Are there members seeking recognition? I would recognize the gentlelady from California then. If you're
No, we support this, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? If not, the question before us is approval of the manager's technical amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to, and we will suspend for just a moment here. We have an amendment. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Shimkus of Illinois and Ms. Eshu of California.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes for purposes of debate of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you and the Chairman of the full committee, of course, the ranking member of the subcommittee for the work together on this. We co-chair the 911 caucus. That technology has moved rapidly like everything else. So we've been working on next generation. How do we make sure that the PSAPs have the equipment needed to meet this new era of broadband, Wi-Fi, you name it. So in consultation with Congresswoman Eshu and working with this and some changes this morning, this is the product. It would authorize $250 million to be used to provide grants to public safety answering points to implement IP-based infrastructure, next generation 911 technology and services, and training support for the migration to next generation 911. It is imperative that we not leave our call centers while working towards our goal of modernization of public safety communications in this country. Our amendment also will require the states to certify that 911 fees collected from consumers are being used for its intended purposes for PSAPs within that state to qualify for funding. States all over the country, including my home state of Illinois, this didn't used to be the case when we first started this, are robbing the E911 funds blind. It's a first step to make sure that these funds are going to where they were intended to go and where the consumer expects them to go. So we're leveraging this part of the money to make sure also that the state funds go in the right direction. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for accepting my amendment, and which I hope you will do, and thank Ranking Member Eshu and her staff for working with me and my staff for a long period of time to get to this point.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be honored to yield.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I appreciate both him and Ms. Eshu's work on this issue for a very long period of time and predecessor 911 issues, and your work in general on public safety over time, and your commitment to public safety has been extraordinary. And when you brought this to my attention, I felt it was important to include it in this legislation. It was appropriate. There was a way to achieve some level of financial support for it here. And I think it makes good policy, and it's bipartisan, and we've tried to do that wherever we could in this process. So I'm delighted to support it, and I appreciate the hard work you've put into it, and I yield back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I could yield unless you want your own time, Anna. Okay, now I yield back my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason I moved to strike the last word is that this work has gone on for a long time. It's been almost a decade. And I really want to thank Congressman Shimkus. He and I are the original co-chairs of the House E911 caucus. There were hardly any takers hardly any interest on either side of the aisle in this issue for a long, long time. We engaged then Senators Byrne and Clinton to do the same thing in the Senate. You can tell how long ago that was because neither one of them are there anymore. But we felt that it was necessary that just as first responders have everything that they need to respond to the calls for help in our community, that the E911 and 911 call centers have that as well. So I know that we're probably standing between this and lunch, and maybe members aren't all that interested in what I'm saying, but I just had to jump in because it really has been a long, winding road. And the people that are in the call centers in every single one of our communities, they're the first ones right there in the trenches. And anyone that's visited their local call center know how essential that is. Mothers and fathers teach their little ones, one of the first things they teach them is to dial 911 in case something goes wrong at home. So I want to thank Mr. Shimkus. I want to thank the chairman for including this in the legislation. The way it'll work is the way CBO scores, they usually are very conservative. We're counting on some money being left over. I'll take that because we've been at it for a long, long time. So I'm going to hope and pray that money is left on the table because it should go to the call centers to bring them into the next generation of taking care of people in our communities across the country. And I will yield back the balance
Will
of
the
my
gentlelady
time.
yield just one moment?
Oh, I'd be glad to, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to commend you and Mr. Shimkus for working together on this. I think it's a great amendment. I've always believed that we're going to recoup more money than CBO gives us the score for. That's been the tradition in the past. They've almost always been off. And this is an area that you'll remember that Bart Stuback and I worked together on the transition from analog to digital, and I think this is a nice piece to come back, and you two have done really good work, and glad that it's going to be accepted as part of this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Are there other members seeking recognition on this important amendment to the Jobs Act? If not, we'll call the question on the amendment. Those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. We're going to stand in recess for just a moment while we have one other member that wanted to offer an amendment and I believe is on the way here to do that. So the gentleman, or the chairman recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu, for 5 minutes on the underlying bill.
On the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask, because the proposal came late and there are still some questions, and then there are some other parts of the bill that I hope between now and full committee markup that you would be willing to sit down and meet with us and see if we can't bridge some of our differences. But the first question that I have is on this. Let's see, on the the $3 billion that you have in the bill, can you take that apart, deconstruct it, and instruct all the members as to what these dollars are for?
Is that a question of council?
Well, I don't know who can answer it. Whomever, if it's council that can answer it, or the chairman, I think
I would yield to council, but we can do it either way. It's up to
The
you.
$3 billion that you're referencing in the bill is a fund that is set aside from the first $3 billion in auction receipts from broadcast incentive auctions in order to repay the reasonably incurred relocation costs of those broadcasters who are being asked to move in order to clear spectrum for the FCC to auction.
And how did you come up with the estimate of $3 billion? Or the $3 billion price tag? I know in ours, I think we had $1 billion for that, correct? Yeah.
The $3 billion that is set aside is not all to be used for that.
But
the repayments
how did
will
you
come
come
out
up with it? How did you come up with it?
We've seen estimates that range anywhere from $1 to $2 billion, and in the interest of not having the FCC's hands tied by not having enough money, we put $3 billion into the fund.
Who
and
requested
then,
it? Did someone request it?
Requested it be $3 billion?
Who
or request the
requested
relocation fund itself?
The $3 billion. I don't, was it something that...
You know, maybe I'd be happy to take that. It's a figure we thought was reasonable. It's not mandated to all be spent. The remainder goes back. I can tell you in correspondence I've had with some of the public television folks, they were relieved to know that the figure was that high because they will have some relocation costs here, and were actually kind of upset about the repacking until they figured out how it worked and that there was a fund here to help pay for their relocation costs. So we just wanted to be reasonable about it and thought that was a good number.
I'm not
That's where
questioning the motivation. I just didn't know where it came from. This was the first time that we had seen it. We hadn't discussed it before, and I just wanted to know what it was based on, what you came up with.
If I may, the reasoning for the change from the original draft. In the original draft, the Republican discussion draft left the FCC full discretion to use all funds collected from the incentive auction in order to meet the relocation needs of reasonably incurred costs. However, because of the way the Public Safety Trust Fund, which was incorporated from the original Democrat discussion draft, is structured, doing so would have held all funds from the broadcast incentive auction in order to make sure all relocation costs were paid prior to making any money available for public safety. In the interest of ensuring that any receipts that come in above the first $3 billion are made immediately available to meet public safety's needs, we changed the structure and had a fixed number.
I'd be glad to.
I find it astounding because the CBO estimated the cost up to $1 billion. The council said that some people estimated it $2 billion, so you throw in an extra $1 billion and say $3 billion. I thought we had problems in this country with the budget deficit. When we talked about the white spaces, I think one of the arguments against what Ms. Eshoo had proposed, and she and I co-sponsored, one of the arguments against is this could be a loss of $1 billion. Well, a loss of $1 billion to foster ingenuity and creativity and new market uses in white space that some of these startups wouldn't be able to afford otherwise. I don't agree to that amount, but that seems to me money that's invested for the future. But just to throw another $2 billion over CBO's estimate doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Yield back.
Would gentlewoman yield? Gentlewoman yield. That's what I said. Yeah. I would just say again, this is a cap on the amount. This isn't what gets spent. Could council direct us to the specific language about reasonable repacking costs?
Well, before you do that, gentlelady, yield to me. Whenever we have an authorization and we say a certain amount, that's the cap, and then the appropriators come in and appropriate the actual amount. You put a limit on it. But the Republican efforts has been to say that the authorization shouldn't be any higher than the appropriation. Now we have caps up there, and usually I find more often than not, I don't want to sound like a Republican, but they make this point over and over again, and they're right. Whenever you put a cap, that usually becomes the floor as well.
Gentlelady's time's expired. I recognize the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with my time, I'll yield to the chairman.
Appreciate that. I would like to go to council on this subject of the cap. That does not require expenditure, correct?
That's correct, sir. The expenditures are handled elsewhere in the bill and are couched into be the reasonable expenditures for the relocation costs of those folks that do not choose to participate as relinquishers of spectrum rights.
And let me reset my time here. There we go. The language in the bill also sets up reasonable standards, right? This isn't a blank check to broadcasters.
That's correct. The standard here is reasonably incurred relocation costs, which is very similar to what was done to the DTV transition in 2005.
And so there is a cap. There's a reasonable amount put under that cap. This is not referenced. This does not go back to the appropriators, correct?
No, it does not.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the appropriators, which I thought I understood Mr. Waxman to say when you authorize, then the appropriators weigh in and do all this. That's not how this works, correct?
No, sir. It's structured with $1 billion of borrowing authority up front in order to begin the process of relocating broadcasters at the end of the auction, but before receipts have come in, and then $3 billion from receipts to meet the reasonable relocation costs.
And the reason we had to do this is because had we not, all the proceeds from the auction would have been tied up. That would have delayed the build-out of broadband had we not created this system.
Correct. No funds from the broadcast television auction would have been available for 13 years.
For 13 years?
Up as long as 13 years.
As long as 13 years. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, would you just yield?
I would certainly, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, the reason I raise this is obvious. It's a lot of money. And we hadn't discussed it before, and I didn't know the background on where the number came from, and I appreciate the discussion. But I also, if I might, when we talk about costs and benefits when it comes to unlicensed, what price tag do we place on what innovation and entrepreneurs will produce for our national economy in the one innovation space that they make use of? And let's keep in mind that they are the public airwaves.
They're reclaiming my time.
To private entities.
Reclaiming my time. We've also asked the broadcasters in DTV to move over and get off analog and give up the analog spectrum in exchange for getting the digital spectrum. We're now coming back a couple of years later and saying, oh, by the way, we're coming back and changing the rules again. Now we're going to voluntarily ask you, to participate to free up more spectrum to meet this demand of wireless broadband.
Right.
And in exchange for that, we're willing to help cover the costs of relocation from the proceeds of the auction, which I think is a reasonable and fair balance, and an inducement, by the way, to get them to participate. Not yet. I'll be happy to in a moment. And so that's part of, I think, the balance that's been struck here to encourage broadcasters to participate, to free up this spectrum, but not to force them to, and to have a fair and equitable way. As I say, this is a capped fund. It is not a blank check. There are reasonable standards here in the statute as we propose it. And when it comes to the issue of unlicensed, remember what you are doing here is actually taking taxpayer funds to clear this spectrum to help pay for the move. And then under your proposal, allow the FCC to cordon off however much, I believe. I don't think, is there a limit on how much the FCC could cordon off for unlicensed in your
There
bill?
is.
Well, whatever that limit is then, we would have paid to clear that and then turn it over to both America's smallest and largest innovative companies to use with no cost. Now, that will generate jobs. I get all that. But I think there's a higher use here for this valuable spectrum in the licensed world. Now, that's not to say there won't be unlicensed in these bands that still could be available as a secondary use, which, by the way, I believe a lot of the things that have been talked about here, from baby monitors to Wi-Fi, are not going to go away. They're in these higher spectrums, are they not, Council, in terms of the spectrum that are used for these various, from baby monitors to Wi-Fi?
Our bill does not change the amount of unlicensed spectrum currently in existence.
And indeed, under the legislation that the Republicans are put forth here, unlicensed, there would probably be more unlicensed made available. that not correct?
The Republican discussion draft explicitly has the FCC begin a proceeding to create unlicensed spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band and would retain the FCC's existing authority for secondary and white space use of spectrum.
And is there any, well, I won't ask you, that's more of a policy question. With that, I will.
Chairman, would you just yield a couple of seconds to me?
I've got 16 of them, and I'll yield them to you.
Okay, and then and Mr. Waxman wanted a couple of seconds as well. I don't question the fairness that needs to be appropriated, excuse the word, but I mean it in the best sense of the word, to broadcasters. And you just outlined where we've been and what we're doing, and that's contained and recognized and honored in both of our bills. So that's not the question. I think that if I had put $3 billion in my base bill, that you'd be asking about it as well. So it's a very honest, fair question.
Reclaiming my time. Do you have in your...
That's why we had $1 billion because of CBO. So I just want to make sure that people understand my sincerity in raising the question.
Mr. Chairman?
All of our time has expired, so does the gentleman seek recognition?
I do.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on the underlying bill. Yeah.
Yes. On the subject before us today, I won't ask about unregulated farm dust. Council, the money that would go to help the broadcasters with a maximum of $3 billion, where does that money come from?
The first $3 billion in receipts from the auction of television spectrum.
And the auction, if the auction funds are being used for that purpose, it's not being used for deficit reduction, right? These are taxpayers, otherwise taxpayers' dollars.
The way the funding is set up under the Public Safety Trust Fund, the first $3 billion from the television auction goes to the relocation fund, and all funds after that go into the trust fund, which has set up a system of priorities for repayment.
Okay. Well, if the FCC, as I understand the purpose of a $3 billion amount, is to be sure the FCC has enough flexibility to meet the cost that may be more than CBO estimates. And CBO estimated $1 billion. And some people said maybe it's $2 billion. So to give them enough flexibility, we're going to provide $3 billion. Now, I guess in my mind, I'm not asking counsel this question, in my mind, I don't see the difference between giving the FCC the ability to deal with that problem from giving the FCC the ability to deal with the white space issue. The argument was that the money that would go to white spaces would be money that won't be returned to maybe the taxpayers, but maybe to the auction fund. And so I just want to draw that point out very clearly. On the one hand, we're keeping the FCC from having discretion where they think it's appropriate, under the circumstances where they think it's appropriate, with, as Ms. Eshu pointed out, a cap. And yet, under this circumstance, to help the broadcasters out, we're going to throw in extra couple $2 billion over what CBO estimates. So that's what I would have said if the chairman had time to yield to me, but I wanted to make that point. I yield to Ms. Escher, yes.
I can't help but observe the following. There's some political cross-dressing in this. The Democrats have, in their base bill, in our base bill, something that represents innovation. You do a cost-benefit analysis, which the Republicans have constantly spoken about, job creation, which we are all for, and certainly you want to promote as you are in the majority. These are all important principles that are a part of the debate on unlicensed spectrum. Now, there are some, and as a key committee staffer, that feels very strongly that this is going to go to one large company. That's not what I'm here for. That's not why I'm a fan of the unlicensed spectrum. It is because this very, very small startups will be choked off if they don't have the right kind of access to this. And so certainly. So, you know, we're promoting the very things that you always talk about and you promote. So that's why I said there's some political cross-dressing in this.
If I could reclaim my time, public safety says they need $7 billion to $10 billion. The Republican bill gives them only $5 billion. Why are we shortchanging public safety if they're going to end up needing $7 to $10 billion, but assuring that we have enough money for the broadcasters? Now, the broadcasters are not required to allow this auction of their spectrum. They have to make a business decision whether it makes sense for them to do it. And if they're making a business decision, they can make a business decision as to whether they're getting enough money. I would hate to think we're going to use that $3 billion for any other purpose than the relocation cost, but when money's on the table, it becomes very attractive to say, well, let's sweeten the pot a little bit if you really want me to volunteer giving up my spectrum. So, I'd like FCC to have more available authorization to protect the white spaces, the unlicensed spaces. I'd like public safety to have adequate money, and I don't see why to go over a CBO estimate of $1 billion. Yield back my time.
Okay, gentleman won't yield. I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield my time to you.
I appreciate that courtesy. And here's what I would say. The first thing in order to get any spectrum available is to make sure that broadcasters voluntarily put it up for auction. We both agree on that. And I think we both agree that there should be a relocation fund to pay for that. The way we structure our bill is to make sure that there's enough adequate resource there that the whole process can move forward, but it is a cap, and it is governed by the Federal Communications Commission, making sure that there is a reasonableness standard imposed on broadcasters seeking repayment for the cost of their relocation. I'll ask counsel, is there any indication that the FCC can go above that $3 billion in our legislation? They can't do that, right?
No, they can't.
And with the reasonable standards and the estimate from GAO that's or CBO that's been referenced here, so if it's $1 billion as the Democrats think, then it's $1 billion, right?
Yes, sir.
And the $2 billion that would remain, what would happen to that money?
If the auction authority that expires in 2021 has not expired, then the money would go to the Public Safety Trust Fund. After 2021, the Public Safety Trust Fund is dissolved and is put into the general fund, so those funds would go to the general fund.
Okay. But meanwhile, they would go to the Public Safety Trust Fund.
Yes.
And so if there are surplus funds that go into the Public Safety Trust Fund, our legislation would allocate $4.96 billion for public safety initial build-out of broadband, public safety. Plus, we have moved and given the D block, which had a CBO score, I think, of about $2.7 billion. Plus, they are in line because CBO has a history of undervaluing the value of spectrum as the market sets it. I think the DTV auction, the latest example, they were off by about 50%. So the funds that come in over the estimated amount, part of which would flow to public safety to achieve the $6.5 billion that they say they need. And so I think we're trying to strike a balance here given very tight fiscal times where we're trying to grow jobs in the private sector. We're trying to free up broadband. My colleague from California cited, I believe it was a Deloitte analysis on the job growth that came from wireless broadband build-out was enormous. And that's the primary purpose of this bill. It is not to carve out very valuable wireless broadband spectrum and then allow the FCC to carve out a chunk of that and give it away for free to whoever wants to use it. That is not to say, just a moment, I will in a moment, that is not to say that there isn't value in unlicensed. And that's not to say there won't be unlicensed developed. And in the area we're clearing that will be in the upper bands, I think it's the 5 gig and beyond, is there not innovation going on in those bands? I would say yes. I mean, we have met with companies who have told us they have some interesting ideas in the upper bands. So I think there is a good balance here, and I think the Republicans have come a long way on these measures and have a bill that works for growing jobs, works from our perspective from public safety. Now, I know public safety wants more. They want D-block, they want $10 billion, they don't want to give back any spectrum. I've been in those meetings. I've seen the emails. I'll tell you what, I don't know anybody else coming to Capitol Hill today that is being offered what we're proposing to offer.
Gentleman yield.
Not yet. I just look at it and say, we're having to make tough budget decisions all over this Hill. This country is in debt up to its eyeballs, its eyebrows, and beyond. And we're trying to carve out $6.5 billion here, which I think is reasonable, to build a new start, a new network. And finally make good on a recommendation from a commission, the 9/11 Commission, that dealt with this issue 10 years ago. The last Congress didn't deal with this. The Congress before that didn't deal with this. And in fact, the former chairman of this committee thought we should auction the D block when he was chairman of the committee. Now that all changed, and I recognize and respect when the president changes your party, you know, maybe others have to change.
And you changed.
And we have changed. Because you know what? I think there is a way to get a balance. But what I don't see coming back is any support for the change in terms of this other issue on the spectrum. Now, the spectrum giveback is actually rose in part out of discussion Mr. Waxman, you and I had about a potential D block and this other coming back. And so I think there's an opportunity here to legislate in a way it creates jobs, takes care of public safety, provides for innovation, and we've achieved that. I'm sorry, I've gone on beyond my time. It's run out. The other members seek recognition. I'm sorry. Yeah, Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member.
I thank you very much for yielding to me. Mr. Chairman, I know you're trying to get the right balance, and we want to help you get that right balance. But, Counsel, let me ask you a question. What happens if we, under the Republican bill, it's $5 billion for public safety, is that right?
$4.96 billion for build out and $40 million for the administration, yes.
Okay. Now, what if it costs more?
We would need to either appropriate more or the states would have to contribute to the fund.
Well, public safety says they need 7 to 10. The Republican bill gives them only 5. And yet we're not building in any cushion. So for them, we got a pretty clear ceiling. And that may be reasonable. But I just want to contrast that with the cushions we are building in on the broadcaster thing. But I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, what you're saying and the work you're trying to do, and I know you put a lot of effort into this legislation, and we want to help you succeed. We think this is important public policy, but there are things to talk about, and we can do them in markups. Maybe we can do them between markups, but I want to get to the point where we're together, and I hope we can get to that point. Thank you, Mr. Markey.
I yield back. I yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. And as I thank you, it's a very broad thank you, because I think that what you have done as the previous both chairman and ranking member of this subcommittee is legendary. There isn't anyone that has the mastery and the understanding of telecommunications in our country, I think, in the entire Congress. I am. I am. And he's always done it well, and the gentleman knows of what he speaks. But at any rate, I wanted to start out with that, since you yielded the rest of the time to me. Mr. Chairman, I think that what is obvious here is that we have some differences that I thought, and I said it in my opening statement, that had we been able to complete our work together as we were meeting, that we would have really come to a consensus on them. In governance, on some of these dollar figures, and on the unlicensed. I hope that you will tell us that we can continue working on these before we go to full committee markup, because it's worth it. It's worth the investment in it. We're operating off the same set of principles in terms of what we want for outcome. And what we're pointing out is some of the, where there are differences, that there's not a consistency of positions on the majority side. So I hope that you would.
Would you yield?
I'd be glad to.
See, here.
Well, you got to ask. Don't you have to ask Mr. Markey?
Yes, I would be glad to yield.
I guess part of it is, as I look at our draft and the 9 meetings you and I personally have had, the last of which Mr. Waxman sat in on, and the unending discussions our staffs, very professional staffs, have had. We've tried to reach these agreements. There are some fundamental differences, though, that I'm not convinced we can overcome on the governance piece. We tried a hybrid model. You all tried your hearts out to figure out, can you take part of what we want, part of what you want, come up with a hybrid? And I think both drafts reflect the fact you probably can't. So then you have to make a choice.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. You know what? I don't agree with you. I think that we can. I think it's worth investing that time. We went dark after October 4th because of your belief that the Supercommittee was somehow going to write this legislation.
If the gentlelady would yield.
I didn't agree.
Actually, the gentleman's time's expired. I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. And regarding the issue of consistency, I appreciate the consistency of their argument, which is it should be unlimited on both. Or, as I was hearing the discussion in regards to the broadcasters, the argument is that the broadcasters should not be reimbursed for any costs they would incur for giving up their spectrum. I think that's what I heard from a couple of members. So the logic is, if you don't support a voluntary system that would make it revenue neutral or neutral to a broadcaster who gives up spectrum, then the substitute of that is, if we need that spectrum, you take it. And so I would, for consistency of argument, expect an amendment from the Democratic side to strike the voluntary auction or voluntary giving up of spectrum provisions and just mandate the FCC take it back with no cost. I think that would be consistent with the rhetoric that we heard here. So I would expect that to be put on the table here somewhat soon. The other part of the discussion with the value to public safety is kind of that old one that we always had with education. Whatever we put up, they will put more up, and then we're never quite there. We're never as good as they are. They support public safety. They support education more because there's more on the table. But it's interesting to me that one of the issues not put in value to public safety is that they are being given D-block, an area where the vast majority of us, and I was one of those that was hell no on D-block, but have changed my position to allow that because we're moving the ball forward and it does help public safety. So why don't we add in the $3 billion of value to D-block that we aren't going to get by auctioning that? So that brings it up to, 5 in essence. And by the way, that was Biden's number when they were working on debt limit issues. So we add in $3 billion, that's 8. Expecting auction to bring in more than expected, they get a percentage, another 1.5 on top of that. So it far exceeds even what the broadband plan, or really hits what the broadband plan had set out. And so I just want to know if the other side's going to strike or object to the voluntary broadcasters voluntarily giving up, and that they would be made whole in that effort. Sure. Are you going to have an amendment? It's a yes and no question, and I will yield to you. Are you going to produce an amendment to back up the rhetoric that you'll go to a mandated taking of spectrum from broadcasters?
No.
Okay,
Never.
I yield
No.
back.
No.
Gentleman,
Did
gentleman's
he
yielded
yield?
back. Yeah, he's yielded back his time.
You won't yield?
I recognize. I'll yield. You answered the question.
Well,
and I
Mr.
thought
Terry,
that's
I think,
inconsistent with
Jerry
the
controls the
argument.
time.
Yeah.
You-
Are you
I
yielding?
yield.
Will you yield?
He yields the time to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Terry, all the members of the committee, everyone that's in the hearing room, I have supported from the get-go, as have the Democrats, the voluntary auction. And we have every step of the way respected what the broadcasters have brought to the table to all of us. There is funding in the bill to help with the transition costs. At no time did we ever object to it. And I think that the bill is one of the basic tenets of the bill relative to voluntary auction is very important, because if the broadcasters didn't agree on that, then we wouldn't be able to move on to reallocate spectrum anywhere. So voluntary has been honored, and it has from the very beginning. So I don't think that there's...
I'll reclaim my
last
last 5 seconds.
I appreciate your giving me time
And,
to make
thank
that
you.
statement. That's
Well,
been there
and
from the
perhaps I
get-go.
was confused when you were talking, when there was discussion about this spectrum being publicly owned, and perhaps we should do... It is, and so the assumptions there and additional arguments that have been made would lead me to conclude that that the FCC should just take it back. So I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn. What purpose do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mrs. Blackburn of Tennessee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes for purposes of debate on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fairly simple amendment. What it would do is to prohibit the FCC from using the licensing process for placing net neutrality or wholesaling conditions on the auction, and it's something that I think is necessary. We know that the FCC used its licensing authority to impose open access obligations in the 700 megahertz band C block and public safety access obligations on the D block. And the open access obligations resulted in fewer and lower bids for the C block, which deprived the Treasury of billions of dollars in that auction. And because of this, I think that as we look at the spectrum auction, what we need to do is to make certain that we prohibit that from taking place again. And we want to move forward with this and do it in a proactive manner. And with that, in the sake of interest, I will yield back. Yes, sir.
It would generally yield, if she'll yield to me. I'd like to ask counsel, does the gentlelady's amendment affect any underlying authority the FCC already has in this matter? Rulemaking authority.
Rulemaking authority?
Yes.
It would affect their rulemaking authority with respect to setting service rules that are specific to a particular license class.
But would it affect them on net neutrality broadly?
Broadly, no.
Yes.
General rulemaking authority would remain intact.
That was my, I didn't phrase it correctly, but general rulemaking authority would remain in effect. Doesn't this in effect, well, I'll say it, my understanding of this amendment is in effect, if the FCC has the authority in this area, they can exercise it. If they don't, they don't. They just can't use the issuance of these licenses as a means to implement net neutrality when they may or may not, and the court's going to decide, have underlying authority in this area. Is that correct? I'll ask the maker of the amendment. Is that correct? Is your understanding?
Yes, that is correct. That is my understanding.
So this isn't, this is license specific in its impact then?
That is the intent.
Okay. Gentlelady, I yield back.
I will yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Recognize gentlewoman from California, Ms. Escher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I oppose this amendment. No surprise. been at it for a long time. I think this amendment prohibits the FCC from applying conditions that require licensees to apply reasonable network management, transparency, and non-discrimination principles in the administration of their networks. And I think that that's an important responsibility. The amendment, in my view, would undermine the FCC's recent open internet order and harm the Commission's ability to impose conditions that promote the public interest. And you know, those are two magnificent words to me, the public interest. And believe it or not, you have to battle for it. It's not recognized as something that is a given. And so in the battle for it, we seek to protect it. At least I do. So I oppose the amendment because I'm concerned that it will severely limit, and that's really the intent, to limit the FCC's authority to impose reasonable and pro-consumer conditions on spectrum auction licensees. Specifically, the amendment prohibits the FCC from applying the principles it adopted in the Commission's open internet order, which I stated a few moments ago, for wireline providers. It would also allow licensees to engage in a panoply of anti-consumer practices. How's that one? Anyone for that? I mean, I don't think that's defensible. Notably, the amendment would allow carriers to manage their network in a discriminatory fashion to favor certain content or applications, all without the need to disclose to their consumers these practices. So, you know, whenever this issue comes up, I'm there with the fly swatter because I think that it's important to stand for the public interest. I think it's important to be opposed to discriminatory practices and anti-consumer practices. So I don't know if there's anyone that would like to use any of the time that I have remaining. I'd be happy to yield. Mr. Markey, you're fine? Okay. With that, I will yield back. I oppose the amendment.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Are there others seeking recognition on the amendment?
Move to strike the last word.
Mr. Terry's recognized for 5 minutes.
I have some thoughts here, and I respect our friend from California's passion to protect the consumers. I would share wholeheartedly in that. Some of that is a little bit art in the sense that perhaps some of what we feel is allowed under that would be price controls or pricing from government, which you know, paying more as you're using more width or broadband does not seem anti-consumer to some of us. So there are a little bit of this that we would think is more art and left up to interpretations. It's not so clear that it's all anti-consumer in here. But David, if I could ask you, if the FCC has authority by courts, could it stop the general rulemaking that of the concerns from Ms. Eshoo?
Is your concern the impact on the FCC's net neutrality rule of this amendment? The FCC's net neutrality rule relies on a number of bases, including the FCC's licensing authority. To the extent that they rely on their licensing authority, this amendment would preclude that. It would not, however, preclude any other bases of authority the FCC relies on in the Act, in their order.
So they could address the gentlelady from California's concerns?
Yes, to the extent that they have the underlying authority for general rulemaking, this would not alter that general rulemaking authority.
I appreciate that. Ms. Blackburn, do you need any additional time I can yield? Yield to the lady.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding to me. I think that in response to the gentleman's question and to the council's remark, I think that it's just important for us to realize that the FCC should not be able to impose regulatory mandates unless the Communications Act explicitly gives the FCC the authority to do so. And what we are doing with this amendment is just making sure that this licensing process is not used as a backdoor means of imposing some of those regulations. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Nebraska and thank him for the time.
Any other? Nope, yield back.
Any other members seek recognition on this issue? The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I think a little bit of telecommunications history would be appropriate at this juncture. First, let me explain that AT&T and all these huge broadband behemoths, they had nothing to do with the invention of the Internet. In fact, the federal government in 1966 offered a contract to AT&T to build a packet switch network across the country, and they said, no, we don't want that contract. We already have a monopoly in long lines. And so they gave the contract to a little company up in Boston, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, who then hired all the people who designed the Internet as we know it today. That was how it happened. AT&T, the big companies, they wanted nothing to do with it. Then, back in the 60s and the 70s, the big behemoths, they said once again, oh, you can't allow small companies to have their own phones that would plug into a switch in a home. If you didn't have a black rotary dial phone controlled by a monopoly, charging $3 per month every month for the life of your grandmother, that could have been 40 years at $3 a month, then that's a pretty good business if you can get it. You know, that's like $1,500 to rent a black rotary dial phone. But if you ever had a phone made by another company, it could bring down the whole phone system of any large city in the United States. Okay? So what does the government have to do? The government has to get in. Yeah, the Bell Labs are great, but they invent stuff, but then they don't deploy it. Why would you deploy something if you already had a monopoly, if you already were in a duopoly? You're already sharing all the profits. And so what did we do? Okay, well, we first began by breaking up AT&T and saying, hey, how about a company like MCI or Sprint or hundreds of other, small and long-distance companies? What if they got in? And what happened? Boom, the price dropped like a rock in long distance. No longer did you have to yell, hey, it's long distance. Grandma's on the phone. Run, because it was $2 a minute. You don't have to do that anymore. Matter of fact, you can just walk outside this room and call grandma in California, which hopefully about 50 of you have done so far today. Okay? That's because we had to reduce monopoly power so that these devices, these services became more accessible to ordinary people. And then what did we have to do? Out of this committee in 1996, not one home in America had broadband. You hear that again? Not one home in America had broadband in 1996. And the technology had been invented in the Bell Labs 15 years before that. Why deploy it? We've got a monopoly. We're not deploying it. We don't feel any paranoia. We don't have to move. We're the big behemoths. And so we passed out of this committee the bill which created Adam Smith smiling in his grave, finally looking at a marketplace that had competition. And you come back 15 years later, and what do you have? You have Facebook and Twitter. You have Hulu and Amazon and a whole vocabulary that was created in just the years since we passed that bill out of this committee. And now, what does the majority say? The majority says, oh my goodness, that's putting too much pressure on the big behemoths. We've got to give them total authority now to decide which applications, which devices, how much any of these companies might be able to move into this marketplace. Oh, that's great. Now, let's just step back for a second and ask the question again. Who invented all of these new technologies? Who made America number one? Did I hear any one of the telephone companies or cable companies inventing anything in the last 15 years? No, I don't think so. I think it all got invented by hundreds and thousands of entrepreneurs across this country that created a new economy. And by the way, branded it made in the USA. Right. They're saying that in Tahrir Square. They're saying it in Tunisia. They're saying it in the big skyscrapers of China as they try to become more competitive in this marketplace. What are they doing there in America? And here we are on the committee that took all the steps, that created and unleashed all this innovation, all these new jobs, not just here but across the planet. And we're saying, let's strip the FCC of their ability to say to the behemoths, you can't take us back to that monopolistic and duopolistic world that basically allowed for black rotary dial phones to flourish. And you know, let's look back and say, was it a good idea to move from black rotary dial phones to BlackBerries, from narrowband to broadband? You know, was that a good idea? I think we should be proud of our past. And the agency of expertise did the job. And what the Blackburn Amendment does is it says to the FCC, you're out of the business of protecting entrepreneurs, protecting the venture capitalists who want to take a chance and get into these marketplaces. I urge you.
Would the gentleman yield for a second, even though you don't have any time?
Glad to yield.
Appreciated your statement. I only have one issue.
Sure.
It didn't rhyme. We're missing.
The gentleman's time's expired.
Can I just say this?
Are there
My
other
claim is
members
to say that
seeking recognition? The gentleman from Illinois is
history doesn't
recognized.
repeat itself, but it does tend to rhyme.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just mark that those who are concerned, like myself, about net neutrality is the basic position that we want a build-out of more pipes, not less. And if you give away something free, you don't incentivize more build-out. So trying to summarize all of Ed's 5 minutes into 15 seconds, that's why I oppose that. So.
Would the gentleman yield?
Now, why?
Would the gentleman yield for a second? Because I think it's an important point to make. If I understand the gentlelady's amendment correctly, it is license specific. If the FCC has the underlying authority by statute to write rules and regulations affecting net neutrality, this amendment does not deny them that right to write those regulations. So let's just put that on the record. And the second point is, I am astounded to learn today that Al Gore is not the one who invented the Internet. I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, and I'd like to yield to the author of the amendment, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. And the chairman is right. It is license specific. And I think to Mr. Markey's point, what we want to make certain is that we do allow these innovators to continue to work. And I would remind Mr. Markey that in paragraph 84 of the net neutrality order, it requires these innovators to go and file with the FCC. That is troublesome. I think it's a good amendment that I have brought forward. I think it is worthy of the consideration of the committee. And I think that what we want to make certain is that we do not have these net neutrality or wholesaling conditions placed on these auctions. And I yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else? Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Chairman, my counsel just whispered in my ear that the statement was not correct, that this takes away any of the ability of the FCC to act. It does. It takes away one of the provisions in the law that allowed the FCC, as they saw it, to promulgate the net neutrality rules. Look, this is a fight over net neutrality. And I remember at the beginning of this year, in this subcommittee, which always had a history of bipartisanship, we all said to each other, oh, we'll be so happy when the net neutrality fight is over, which was waged on the law that could stop a regulation that was being proposed, and the congressional approval law of those regulations. And we passed it. We fought about it. We had hearings. We fought about it. The Republican majority prevailed. Maybe you had some Democrats, but nevertheless, the bill passed. And it's sitting in the Senate. It's not sitting in the Senate? It was defeated in the Senate. Okay, so you couldn't win it that way. This provision, or one very similar to it, was in the original draft of the chairman's bill on this legislation for spectrum and public safety. And we started to talk and try to see if we can reach a compromise, and the chairman took it out as a concession to us so that we could move forward on the rest of the bill. Now, I oppose this on the merits, but it just seems to me you can add this in here if you want, but it's not going to survive. The Senate's not going to accept it. It may bring down the whole bill. It's going to make it harder for us to reach a compromise on a bipartisan basis on the bill where we should reach a bipartisan consensus, and we're so anxious to agree to one. So I just think it's unwise to have this amendment in there. It becomes a poison pill. It distracts us from getting to the real job of dealing with the public safety and the spectrum auction. And so I would urge my colleagues to oppose it, and I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Markup.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The language of the amendment says that the Federal Communications Commission may not impose any condition on the licenses assigned through this system. And then it basically goes on to say the FCC can't basically say to the licensee once they get it anything about applications or services or devices on the network. Well, that takes us back to the black rotary dial phone, and it takes us back to all the other services again, okay? And so this is a limitation on the protection of someone that's got a new gadget, got a new application, got something that's a little bit different than whoever it was that, you know, thought that they knew everything about telecommunications. And that's who we are. That's the United States of America. That's why they send so many exchange students to our country. But you want to know what? They don't have a culture of ideas in China. They don't have a culture of ideas in the Arab world. This is our edge. Our edge is that that's our culture. And if you stifle that, if you put a wet blanket over that, you're killing what it is that differentiates us from the rest of the world in terms of what we bring to the marketplace.
If I could
reclaim, I'd be glad to yield back
my time. I agree with your argument. I agree on the substance that we ought to leave the FCC rules on net neutrality in place. There's disagreement with that. I understand. A majority of this committee disagrees with that position. But Chairman Walden was willing to work with us by taking this out of his original draft, and we thought that was a good faith gesture, and we appreciated it. But if we put it back in, it just seems to me now is not the time to move us further apart. So I would hope the Republicans, just because you have the votes and you can do it, should refrain from doing it and not put it back in, because you're going to have to take it out eventually. And let's get a better climate so we can agree on a final bill. Yield my time, or yield it back, or whatever. I'll yield it back. You want?
Gentleman yields back.
Okay, that's fine.
Any other member seeking recognition on this amendment? If not, the question comes for the subcommittee on approval of the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay.
No.
While the nays may have sounded louder, there are actually more of the ayes present. So the amendment is approved and adopted. Now, are there other amendments? The gentlelady from California is recognized to strike the last word.
Well, in the hopes of reaching some sort of bipartisan consensus, I want to bring up an issue that's important to public safety and most of us here, I believe. I really have to talk about the Republican provision that will require public safety to return 14 megahertz of their existing 700 megahertz for commercial use. First of all, this is a spectrum give back, obviously. First, it would place public safety communications at risk. Public safety presently depends upon the use of 700 megahertz narrowband spectrum to satisfy their capacity needs, especially in urban areas where all public safety bands are highly congested. The draft will drive public safety to abandon plans to deploy in this spectrum out of fear of losing their investments, thereby adding to their existing capacity constraints. Second, it would have an adverse effect on state and local investments. Numerous state and local governments have expended large sums of public money into deploying 700 megahertz narrowband networks. The draft puts these investments at risk. Third, it's just unfair because the draft reallocates a 10 megahertz D block to public safety, but then has in return to 14 megahertz. Finally, as far as a trigger, if there is a trigger, at a minimum, the correct trigger should be when the LTE broadband network can support mission-critical voice communications. I think this is a very important issue, and I believe it's something that we all ought to be discussing. We have plenty of time before the the markup of the full committee. So
would the gentlelady yield on some of those points?
certainly.
So I'd like to go to council to the language in the bill, because we tried to very carefully protect public safety. And in fact, the transition wouldn't occur until 5 years after the administrator certifies that there is a public safety secure ability to do talk over broadband. And I wonder if council could direct us to that specific language, because this is an important concern.
Yeah. Section 102A1 of the Republican discussion draft states that on a date that is 5 years after a certification by the administrator to the Commission of the availability of standards for public safety voice over broadband, the Commission shall, notwithstanding paragraph 15A of Section 309J of the Communications Act of 1934, reallocate the 700 megahertz public safety.
So it's 5 years after there's a certification that meets the needs. The second point is there's a fund established to pay public safety for their costs to shift off. It's your time. I'll yield back.
Yeah, reclaiming my time. I understand that that trigger can be imposed at any time before the 5 years. Is that correct?
Can you direct us in the language
triggering
where
event
that would
for,
occur?
to start the 5-year clock, ma'am, or the triggering event to return the narrowband spectrum?
Okay, my understanding is the administrator can at any point make the decision to impose a 5-year trigger.
The administrator must certify to the Federal Communications Commission that standards exist for public safety voice over broadband.
But it can do it before the 5-year period, right?
The 5-year period doesn't begin until the certification occurs.
After
5
that?
years runs after the certification that standards are available.
Okay, then what about the standards, though? What is meant by the standards? It could mean anything, from what I understand. Who's to say that it's what is unclear about what is meant public safety voice over broadband? Who's to say that the private companies chosen as administrator and empowered to make this determination could not simply declare that these standards are available right away?
There exists an appeal process for decisions of the administrator under the Act. I'm sorry. There's an appeal process for decisions of the administrator under the Republican draft.
And that means going to the federal district court to appeal. Is that right?
Yes, it does.
Wow.
Well,
Makes it very
if the gentlelady would yield, though, who determines under the legislation what those standards are? Where is that set?
It is not set. There are many standards bodies that set standards for the telecommunications.
So that's unclear then, what you're saying?
It is not set in statute.
It's not set. So we have a trigger with standards that are unclear. Is that correct?
We have a trigger that is set by the standardization of public safety broadband
Right,
voice.
that are unclear at this point in time. I'm just, say yes or no.
We do not delineate who sets the standard.
So the answer is no. So there are no standards. It's unclear what the standards are. Is that correct?
Of course, it's unclear what the standards are, but there's no standard. So there are many
unclear
standards.
I just want to get clear. Are the standards clear?
No, we're instructing them to set standards, ma'am.
But they're unclear.
Well, if generally would yield, they haven't been set yet. So it's hard to say they're clear or unclear if they haven't been
But we're talking
set.
about certain standards, so you must have some idea of standards. I mean, we're talking about a 5-year trigger here.
I don't, ma'am. The Act does not opine on what the standard should read.
Well, we better work on this moving forward. So,
Gentlelady's time has expired. Anyone else seeking recognition? If not, the question now occurs on favorably. I'm sorry. Ms. Escher seeks recognition.
Question of the council on this issue of having to go to court. Can you elaborate on that and under what set of circumstances that process is triggered?
Decisions of the administrator are subject to an appeal process. That
The what?
They're subject to an appeal process. That process is detailed. So give me one moment to flip through. In Section 203D on page 61, review of decisions of the administrator.
Can you walk us through this in just regular language, how this is going to work? All right? So there's an administrator. There are public safety has the ability to appeal the decision of the administrator, and then what happens?
At the risk of lapsing into legalese, those with standing will have
I know
the
it's hard
ability,
for you.
I know. Are able to challenge the decisions of the administrator under an arbitration standard at the federal district court.
Yeah.
So when
And, approximately, as an attorney, how long does that usually take?
it's a variable amount of time, ma'am.
A variable. Give me an estimate.
I don't have one.
You don't know. All right. My observation here, Mr. Chairman, is that this isn't clear, and I don't think it's well thought out. And I think that we're getting into a thicket of bureaucracy / semi litigation. And I don't think that's the way we want to construct this. I don't think you do, and I don't think we do. This really requires some more work, and we need to think this out. I can't help but think that if I propose this, that someone on the other side of the aisle would be saying exactly what I'm saying right now. So I think this needs some work.
The gentleman yield.
I'd be glad to.
In your draft, is there an appeal mechanism for for public safety for decisions made by your corporation? Do they have a right of appeal? I realize you don't give back take back the spectrum and all, but can you? Is there a way if a locality or public safety opposes the
Just a second. Mm-hmm. Well, I think as the staff is pointing out, that we have two different setups. One is a not-for-profit corporation,
right?
And the other is a private administrator. We believe that the not-for-profit governance model serves this issue and how to actually implement a major part of the bill in a much better way.
But my question was...
Well, no, you asked, and so I'm...
Is there an appeal mechanism if those involved under your corporate nonprofit model disagree with the decisions made on their build-out of the broadband, their program? Mm-hmm. Is there a way to appeal that?
Well, we were, as you recall, the staffs were talking about this very issue, and arbitration was something that was on the table.
But in the bill you submitted today,
no, because we never came to any kind of an agreement on it.
Right, but I know. But in your alternative, is there an appeal mechanism? Ours at least has. You
no,
can't
there
appeal.
Isn't. There isn't.
Okay. All right.
There isn't, and it points to taking back my time. If we had continued our discussion, perhaps we would have been able to breach this area. But I think I can't speak for everyone. I think that this is unsettled and uncomfortable and not thought out very well. I don't think we want people to be litigating, going through federal court and whatever. We have to get to the implementation of a national interoperable network in our country. Yep. And you want that, I want that, all the members want that. This doesn't, for some reason, this is not the right size. It doesn't fit. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. And I'd like to thank the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Matsui, for her advocacy and her excellent questions and points made on this issue.
Are there other members seeking recognition? If not, then the question before us occurs on favorably reporting the bill to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported.
Request a roll call.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Christensen? Mr. Towns? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush? Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman votes no. Chairman Walden?
Walden votes aye. Are there other members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns votes aye.
Mr. Rogers?
Mr. Rogers votes aye.
Are there other members seeking to be recorded? Rushing in the doors. If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 ayes, 6 nays.
17 ayes and 6 nays. Without the bill is passed. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill as approved by the committee today, and is so ordered, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.